Good afternoon and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third annual conference on women in macroeconomics, hosted by Rebuilding Macroeconomics, which is an ESRC large investment, hosted at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research in London. But today we're very much global. We have speakers mostly from the other side of the pond that we're delighted can join us. And that's one of the great benefits of the world that we find ourselves in. We seem to become much more international, which is terrific. My name is Angus Armstrong. I'm the director of Rebuilding Macroeconomics, and my very simple job is just to introduce the ground rules, so to speak, for everybody taking part today, and to welcome our chairperson, Susan Smith, from Girton College. So just to remind everybody of how to take part in the discussions, because there's plenty of scope for discussions. And this is, after all, a festival of social science events. So the idea is to have some discussion. There's a chat function, which I'm sure you probably all know by now, at the bottom of the screen. If you just click that, open it up, and type in your questions, and you address to everyone and the panelists, then everybody can see it. And I'm sure Sarah will pick up the questions as she thinks they're appropriate and put them to the panelists. So please do engage in the chat. The second thing to say is this is being recorded, so I think we have to say that. So, so you'll be reappearing on the Rebuilding Macroeconomics website probably in about a week's time. It takes a little bit of a while to edit these things, but this will all be there. And the third thing to say is that we will be sending round by a Survey Monkey an appraisal form. We have to do this for the ESRC, and we'd be extremely grateful if you could fill this in. It's just clicking a few boxes, and that would help us all out. So that's the notices, and it is my great pleasure to hand over to Susan Smith. Susan is a geographer, but a geographer with a bit of a difference in my view. Not that I know a great deal about geography, but she gets very much involved in what I'd call some very human economic problems, in particular housing, issues around sociability, morality, and so on. Very much the sort of issues that we at Rebuilding Macroeconomics are interested in. And last year we held our conference at Girton College, which was a terrific success. Girton's a wonderful place. It had its 150th anniversary last year, and I was very fortunate to have been invited to take part in some of their celebrations. An absolutely terrific college. So we're delighted that she's agreed to chair our event today. As well as still teaching, she also has to run this institute. I think has been there for 10 years now. And everything I know about the place and the people who study there, but also the famous alumni, you know, not least people like Barbara Wootton, a very famous and influential policymaker for the welfare state in the United Kingdom, but also Joan Robinson, who sort of looms larger than life on this whole profession, are alumni of that great institution. So Susan, welcome to you. Thank you very much indeed for agreeing to be our chairperson for today. And I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Angus, and for the introduction to join you all. As Angus pointed out, I'm not an economist. And but what I really like about the way that these areas of economics are going anyway, and particularly the rebuilding macro movement is precisely because of the willingness and readiness to engage in dialogue, even with amateurs like myself, who, to coin a well-worn phrase, you know, feel the economy is far too important to leave just to a group of economists. So, you know, we've been having that sort of dialogue for some time, and it's really a great pleasure to be involved in a group and in a series that really takes that to heart. And I'm sure that's going to be the spirit of our discussion today. Now, Angus has kindly left me far too much time to introduce a session with some absolutely brilliant speakers in it, who are far more immersed in these issues than I am. But I thought I would just take a few minutes just to unpack some of the, you know, perhaps some of the most obvious points that we might want to make, but just to give them a little tiny bit of context from a little bit of my own experience and that of my institution, if that's okay. Because the sort of key question is, we know that diversity is fairer, but could it also be a vehicle for scientific progress? Well, that of course is a rhetorical question. You know, we know from the start that the answer is yes. And obviously what we're here to do is to unpack that answer. And I thought I could just set the scene by touching on two things that are pretty self-evident in that presumption, but that the more you try to unpack them, perhaps the more complex they become. So the first thing that's implied, I think, in that opening question is there some kind of a trade-off between what's fair and ethically sound and what's best in terms of scholarly knowledge and potential? You know, is being radically inclusive going to compromise the quality of economics as a discipline or as a practice? Now, of course, the answer is no. But as the head of this college, Girton College, it was the first UK higher education institution to admit women to study to degree level. Not, I should say, to matriculate for degrees, because at Cambridge that came a toe curling 8 decades later. But I do smart every day looking around the institution from the scars left by one of the most influential early arguments against inclusion, which was simply that adding women to the mix would damage the reputation of the great universities. So quite simply and very explicitly, in those early days of this institution and many others, the fact that women were not thought to be as good as men excluded them from full participation in learning and research and all of the professional accomplishments that go with that. Now, what we find, of course, in the history of institutions like ours, and there are many more scattered around the world, that when women did start to intrude, and they did intrude, you know, they weren't invited. Nobody sat down and said, oh, yeah, we've missed half of you, you know, would you please come through the door? When they did start to intrude, quite the opposite to what was expected by the people who were guarding the door occurred. The women who'd been locked out did as well as, often much better than, the men who were guarding the door, even in areas that men still dominate, like maths, physics, economics, what we're talking about today. And these are still areas in which some of the most brilliant women of the last century, although we now know they were brilliant, remain as hidden figures. You can look at Girton's timeline that Angus alluded to a minute ago. People like Barbara Wootton, who have only, you know, their contributions only just really being excavated. Eileen Power, Joan Robinson. They were hidden for well, perhaps not Joan actually, but you know, the rest were quite hidden for a long while. But whether hidden or not, their work has testified for a long time to the fact that women's equal intellectual accomplishment was marked, and it belied the degree of underrepresentation then, but also that somehow still persists. And it's that persistence, I'm sure, that's going to be part of our conversation, because exclusionary tactics are much more subtle now, you know, because nobody now says that women can't do as well as men. But I bet nearly everyone in this seminar has witnessed in some guise or other the argument that scholars and scholarship on the margins is not quite as good or as relevant or as pertinent as that in the mainstream. It's a pervasive view, and it still mitigates against inclusion, and it still compounds the partiality of knowledge. The institutional excuse is kind of elaborated a little bit into, on the one hand, a kind of defense of the inertia of a zero-sum game. You know, you can't let new blood in until the old guard has let itself out, is one view. And more recently, I'm sorry to say, led by our own government, there's a bit of a bid to step back from initiatives like the internationally recognised Athena Swan Charter for gender inequality and the Separate Race Equality Charter on the grounds that it's necessary to reduce bureaucracy. You know, we better not spend too much time pursuing these things, because otherwise we might not be able to do the real stuff of our scholarly mandate. But if history tells us anything, and this comment should be set in an intersectional context, because it's of course not just about gender, it's really that no institution, no discipline, and no area of scholarly work can claim to be excellent if it's not also diverse. You know, that you shouldn't really be thinking of a trade-off between fairness and scientific progress. That's kind of written into our title today, because it's clear that the more you limit the pool you draw from, the less likely you are to do the best that you could. So for an institution, the challenge is not somehow, I think, to combine the principles of excellence and inclusion. A much better strapline, if you want to talk about the very best scholarship and the very best professional achievement, is inclusive excellence. I was lucky enough to deliberate on this with the heads of some of the Seven Sisters institutions in the USA at the end of 2018. If you want to look at that discussion, it's on our online archive. I think it's quite an interesting one. We were thinking about the future role of colleges founded for women, even colleges like Girton that have gone mixed. And I think we were all clear that if your only claim is to excellence, then you're not quite excellent enough to make the cut in today's complex world. So that's a kind of starting point on that first, quite obvious, but still very complex question. The second question that's kind of implied in our title is, will greater diversity in the scholarly community not only make the best of scholarship better, but will it also enlarge our field of vision? Will it change our perspective and bring different worlds into view, give us different ways of knowing and seeing and being? Well, again, the answer is going to be yes, isn't it? But it's a trickier theme, I think, this one. The idea of positionality, it's been around for a very long time. Who we are, the structures that we're embedded in, they're bound to affect the way we view and explore and construct the world. We can't help ourselves, whoever we are, introducing presumptions and biases into the knowledges that we work with and produce. So it's got to be the case that the more positions they are, providing those occupying them have a voice, then the more productive the debate, the more complete the combined view of the problems and possibilities that form the world there will be. Now, I think I only want to say that really to set the scene for now, but I do want to make the point that I don't think this is some kind of comfortable conversation where, all the voices get, invited around the table and we have some nice, cozy shared view emerging of the reality of the world. That didn't happen in the past that I was talking about when women were trying to get into higher education. They intruded. It's not going to happen now. So one thing I was going to say is, of course, we've got to be polite. We're being recorded and we're in an open setting, but it shouldn't be too polite, should it? Because we're not going to get anywhere, are we, unless we're prepared to have our feathers a bit ruffled. We should be thinking about confrontation as well as deliberation. We should be ready to unsettle and to be unsettled, to disrupt, to jostle for space. That's the only way we're going to change the optics, I think. And that's the only way we're going to bring new perspectives and different ways of seeing and doing and making the world onto the table. And we're going to enjoy some of that debate, engage in some of that debate right now. I would just say before we do that, having tackled the first question with a kind of institutional example, I was thinking of a more personal perspective that I've got on this second point. And I might bring it into the conversation. I won't bore you with it now, but it's sort of about the challenge that we all face as individuals in getting beyond the narrowness of voice and perspective that we know can't go on, yet somehow we still conspire to it. That's why I don't think we should be too polite this afternoon. And that's something that we've got experts here anyway to discuss. So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do a little bit of a scene set. But we're going to move on to a group of 3 papers that are really going to, I think, press far deeper into these issues than I've done here. And that's the most important thing this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce the first straight away. It's Dr. Kristen Interman, and she's going to talk about how diversity and inclusivity benefit research. And she can do that because she's actually a professor for the philosophy of science, ethics, and feminist philosophy at Montana State University. And she's an expert on matters around objectivity, bias, and diversity in science. So I'm going to invite Kristen to have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thanks to Angus and Carla for organizing this and for all their work in bringing together such a great group of speakers. I too will preface my talk by acknowledging, as Susan indicated, I'm not an economist, but I am a philosopher, and I also direct the Initiative for Science, Technology, Ethics, and Society at Montana State University, and so do a lot of collaborative work, both with social scientists as well as physical scientists and engineers. And so I'm gonna just share my screen, I think. Let's see here. I don't think I need to optimize for, oops, okay. So let me just start the slideshow. So I wanted to actually start just by, this is data is a few years old, and this is data from the US, sort of both tracking faculty representation at public universities in the United States, both by gender and race. And as Susan alluded to, there's still sort of these persistent gaps, particularly in certain disciplines. You can see economics is sort of in the middle here. And so female is the kind of red bar, male is the yellow bar. And as you can see, also predominantly white. My own discipline, philosophy, is sadly perhaps as bad, if not worse, than economics in terms of representation. A little bit better for females, but pretty bad. We have about 30% in philosophy of women, particularly bad for people of color, unfortunately, although that's slowly changing. But it's sort of notable that, you know, there have been so many initiatives aimed at trying to increase diversity and inclusivity in STEM fields and in academia in general, and yet we still have a really long way to go. And then similarly in the UK, this was an article from The Guardian around the same time as that other data. And so in the same time period, at UK universities, the statistics by Advance HE found that there was 25 Black women and 90 Black men among 19,000 professors, right? So still having a long way to go. Probably most of you, this is not surprising. So I want to build off of what Susan said in her introductory remarks about why exactly, pinpointing why exactly diversity might be important. And I think it's important to distinguish several potential reasons why diversity is important. As Susan sort of alluded to, there's what you know, I would call a kind of social justice rationale. And that is, we do think that in liberal pluralistic democracies, right, this idea that people should have equal opportunity. Often STEM fields, careers in academia are also financially beneficial. And so we think that from a social justice perspective, it would be wrong to exclude groups of people from particular career fields or career paths, limiting opportunities, limiting the sorts of things that people are drawn to. So that is bad kind of from an ethical perspective. And then there's kind of a pragmatic reason to think that diversity is important. And this is what I often hear from a lot of people in the private sector actually too. But you know, the idea is if we exclude certain groups of people from our disciplines, part of what we're doing is limiting the pool of talented people that there are arbitrarily. So we're in some ways kind of denying ourselves the opportunity to draw from the best and the brightest, which I take as sort of a kind of more pragmatic concern. But what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about is this last argument that Susan brought up and that she said was the harder one to make, right? But this idea that it's not just that diversity is important for social and political reasons. It's not just that, you know, for pragmatic reasons, but actually it could enhance our research. While some of what I'm going to try to direct some of my comments to economics, although not all the examples I use will be from macroeconomics, but my hope is to kind of give a roadmap of what we've seen in a lot of disciplines to help you think about how this might also be the case in your discipline. So how can diversity contribute to better research? So there's still probably a lot of people that have the kind of dominant view, which has been around for a long time, that this seems kind of weird because we think of ourselves as researchers that employ deductive methods. We have inductive methods. We have models. We're grounded in empirical research. It's scientific, it's objective. And so it shouldn't matter who's doing the research, right? That we should always come to some of the same conclusions that are supported by evidence. But the truth is that the picture's a lot messier. But I want to make clear at the outset that I'm not trying to imply that that in economics or in any other discipline, that the fact that it might make a difference to who's doing research, that somehow means it's just all up in the air and none of our theories are grounded and everything's subjective. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So the core argument that I want to make is that there are really decisions that researchers make throughout research that depend on a variety of assumptions. We make background assumptions about what to build into models, and when we're trying to test those models. We make judgments about what kind of data is needed in order to address a particular problem. We make judgments about which methodologies and models may be best appropriate to try to get some of that data. We make judgments about how to classify and categorize the phenomena that we're trying to study. And we make judgments about how to interpret that data, often sort of making comparative judgments about whether some explanation is more plausible than another. And so the core thesis I want to advance is that our experiences and values, which are often structured by social conditions, political conditions, material conditions that we live in, right, and that shape our lives and the kinds of experiences that we're likely to have, those influence, right, which choices and assumptions seem reasonable, seem plausible. In some cases, they even influence what background assumptions or judgments even occur to us, right? And that those, because of ways in which our societies have been socially and historically structured, things like race, things like gender, things like class can make a difference to these sorts of things. So the more that we expand the pool of people doing research to have people from vast backgrounds, kind of the bigger the pool is in terms of the kinds of assumptions that might be made. So I'm going to just try to give a few quick examples. So obviously one area where this happens is how we frame and pursue particular research questions as opposed to others. I was just looking, I noticed, so one question that's being asked now by people in the US is how well prepared is the typical household for the coming shock of lost jobs and income in relation to the pandemic? Of course, what do we mean by typical household, right? And there might be different ways of thinking about that. And there might even be different ways of posing that question. And those reflect the kind of values we have, what we're interested. Every time we ask a research question, we make certain things visible and we kind of ignore or neglect other aspects of the phenomena. And so how we ask those questions sort of makes a difference to what sort of things we shine a light on. Similarly, another example, this is related to some of my own research, but I noticed that, for example, in climate economics, a lot of the question that gets asked is, how will food production be impacted by climate change? And the methods that often get used to answer that sort of look at aggregate impacts, right, to food production as a result of climate change. But as many scholars have pointed out, that ignores, right, and so what sometimes people have said is, well, we're going to have droughts and less food production in certain places, but we're going to have places like Montana, where I live, maybe we'll get a longer growing season and habitable temperatures finally. And so, it's all going to balance out. But of course, that fails to look at the relationships of dependency and power, that would potentially change as the result as to how food is distributed throughout the globe. And in particular, how the global South may be disproportionately impacted in ways that would only exacerbate existing inequalities. And so, making the assumption about what's important can be really important. And it's important towards generating the kinds of data that could justify particular policies. Similarly, right, sort of maybe a more old school view now, but thinking about who's an economic actor, and the use of the idea of the head of household, right, in economics was useful in some ways, right, in modeling. However, of course, it again obscured potentially dynamics within households and relations of financial dependency and other aspects that we might think are really important to understanding inequalities. Collection of data in a variety of ways. So there have been great work in sociology looking at how researchers looked at harms of divorce. And typically, harms from divorce that were examined and measured were often economic, looking at how are children impacted when they have two parents and that have to maintain two different households, how psychological impacts from either going back and forth between two households or whatnot, or being separated from a parent. But of course, there's other kinds of harms of divorce we might think about, such as what is the harm to children staying in a family or a living situation where there's significant problems, or even potentially inequalities, and how, and relations of dependence. And so how does that impact them? Thinking about the benefit of labor unions, right? And so oftentimes in labor economics, what gets measured is thinking about, well, to what extent do people experience an increase in wages or benefits or any of these things? But of course, there's other benefits to unions that are non-economic and that may be really important. And thinking about climate change impacts. So oftentimes, again, there's a temptation to look at the impacts of climate change by thinking about things like how much GDP is lost, or how much, how many lives will be lost, or things that are kind of easily quantifiable. But of course, there are other things that are impacted that are valued greatly by, for example, Indigenous and Native peoples, hunting traditions, being able to stay in the territory where you have history and culture and memories, which, for complicated reasons, obviously tend to receive less attention. And obviously another issue here is trust, and thinking about using decisions about whether to use qualitative and mixed methods approaches in economics, and thinking about whether or not that could provide valuable data. So really briefly, I'm going to try to wrap it up here. So diversity increases the likelihood that implicit biases, unjustified assumptions will be caught, assessed, addressed, critically evaluated. It may help provide alternatives or make things visible that haven't ever before. It can expand and enhance evidence, models, and theories. It can increase thinking about research problems just from different perspectives in a way that can be fruitful. And I'm gonna not be able to say too much about this, but I didn't want to end without also saying, and I think we're going to be talking about this, several other speakers are going to be talking about this issue, that as important as diversity is potentially to research, it's not sufficient. We can't just focus on increasing the numbers of certain underrepresented groups in academia and science and economics, because as I think one of the speakers is going to talk about this afternoon, there's several interrelated problems. It's not enough just to increase numbers, because you also have to support creating an environment where all researchers have a kind of equality of intellectual authority, where the work they do is being seen as valuable and important. And there's many ways in which that often doesn't happen. And I have a whole list of things here that kind of contribute to an environment of exclusivity, right? And so if you're just trying to increase numbers, but then you have a hard time recruiting, retaining people, or you don't value their work, or don't listen to them when they challenge assumptions, that's also problematic, right? So, so thinking about how can we create not just, not increase numbers of people, but really create an environment where that's inclusive to research being done from a variety of different perspectives. As Susan said, inclusive excellence. And that's not going to be easy, but I'm excited to hear what some of the other speakers have to say about how to do that. So I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
I always fall for that one. Thank you so much for that, Kristen. That was really fantastically stimulating. We've got a couple. What I'm going to do is take this group of 3 papers and have a general Q&A. But if there's just a couple of questions just to follow up or clarify, we can take them now if anybody wants to. I see people on the chat are very shy at the moment. I've got one question about the Romans being happy to rely heavily on Greek practitioners in philosophy and drama. I'm not quite sure. I don't really know anything about the Greeks and the Romans, or whether it's apposite or not, but you're a philosopher, so you might want to say something about
Well, so one thing I'll just say is, you know, so I think the question is, you know, is that an example of benefits of racial diversity? So unfortunately, I am also not an expert in ancient philosophy, although I, you know, teach Aristotle in my classes, in my intro classes. But one thing I'll say is, one thing even my students have noticed studying Western philosophy is what, you know, how it is that the history of philosophy has often sort of excluded, for example, Eastern philosophical views. We don't teach that as the canon, right? And my students, it's very exciting because they come up, you know, they recognize that, wow, we've lost all of these incredibly important conceptual tools and resources by not learning about those other alternative views. And so I can't hold up philosophy, unfortunately, as a great example of inclusivity and diversity over the years, but we are working on it. We're working on it.
Are there any other short interventions right now? Can I just ask one, because we've got a couple of minutes, and I just thought it might set a little bit further of the scene. You made a really good point about non-traditional practices, different ways of going on, you know, not being acceptable and seen as marginal. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about, you know, we're quite locked into certain practices as academics, aren't we? You know, we write papers, for example, you know, we generally do that. We present a bit. That's about it, really, isn't it? Do you think that there is a lot further to go in terms of bringing different ways of practicing and doing research and talking about it, acting it out?
Well, I mean, you know, on the one hand, I mean, so this is the challenge, right? Because on the one hand, if we have this idea of, no, that's right, we want to maintain our standards and we just want to create a culture where more people can meet those standards, right? You know, it is incumbent on us to think critically about ways in which the standards themselves may be limiting a little bit. But, you know, that's obviously a very difficult thing to change. You know, and how radical of a change is needed is not clear, right? You know, but it is, I know that, so for example, in my own discipline in philosophy, you know, we pride ourselves, I mean, we have peer reviewed papers and books, but not just that, we tend to praise the work in philosophy that is the most abstract, most obscure, logically rigorous, right? So like people that work in the metaphysics of time, right? Or formal symbolic logic. And, you know, I think there's a good question. Well, why should we think that's somehow more rigorous than people who work in ethics or questions of social justice or questions of philosophy of science or questions about how ignorance is produced and maintained? So, I mean, I do, you know, and it could turn out that that valuation is itself not justified. But I think that's an open question. So, but I think these are the kind of debates we need to have within academia.
Thanks. Well, we'll go on to the next part of that debate then, and I'd like to, very delighted actually to have the opportunity to introduce Rhonda Devonshire Sharp, and Rhonda is the founder and president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity and Race, and is a co-author of this book on the Black women in the US economy, the hardest working woman. So it's great to have you with us today, Rhonda. And the title that Rhonda's going to talk to is The Quest for Inclusion in Economics in the US, 50 years of slow progress. Well, I believe that, but I'm very interested to hear more about it. So over to you.
So thank you for having me this morning. And let me say, like, Kristen, you caught my attention when you said how ignorance is perpetuated and maintained. I was like, wait, what? that is, I feel like that's so often the conversation. I too am going to share my screen. And I'll start by also saying that the work that I'm going to be talking about this morning is a forthcoming chapter in Routledge's handbook of Feminist Economics that is going to be edited by Barik and Conger, sorry, give me 1 second. And so I titled my paper, or the title of my talk in the chapter, The Quest for Inclusion in Economics in the US, 50 Years of Slow Progress, because I feel like we've had this this increase in conversation about diversity. And it is both annoying and tiring because it's a conversation that's been going on at least, I would say, in a public and very concerted way since the late 1960s. And so I am going to focus on what sort of my thoughts about what it takes to have an inclusive and equitable society, and then the role that the economics profession plays in that, and what the profession as a whole needs to do. So I'm going to start by saying, if we are to have an inclusive and equitable society, the economics profession needs to do three things. And the first is, and we hear lots of conversations about this, and even Kristen talked about it in her talk, is this notion of experiences, that we need to have economists whose experiences are reflective of a diverse social group. And I'm going to talk about these social groups initially in terms of affinity groups that we have in the US that increase professional representation. And as we have the experiences that reflect diverse social groups, the thought is that we will have policies that will improve the well-being of all people. And the second is that we want to have diversity in scholarship. And again, Kristen talked about this. It is this notion about, I like to think about whose work is deemed credible. And I'll also talk about some of the journals that have come out to validate the work that scholars are doing. And then, the last is that the diversity of the profession increases awareness for social provisions from the perspective of various social groups. And that's work from Marilyn Powers. And so again, it is coming back to this notion that we can improve the well-being of marginalized groups. And so from a historical perspective, as I said, I was going to talk about diverse social groups as affinity groups. The National Economics Association, which started off as the Black Caucus, just celebrated their 50th anniversary in San Diego. And for me, it was very interesting to hear the founders of the Black Caucus talk about the AEA's response to this and how they met in a room, and they were expressing their concerns about representation, and that the larger AEA actually had police in the hotel because they thought, if you can get this, right, that economists were really going to be radical. And I don't mean in the radical sense as the Union for Radical Political Economists, but somehow they thought that these Black economists were going to become violent. And one of the things they put together was this suggested bill of particulars. And out of that bill, they had essentially 5 things. One was to appoint an associate secretary that would be selected by the Black Caucus and whose primary function would be to give directions designed to improve the status of, in particular, Black economists, but non-white economists more broadly. And then 2, implement finance plans to increase the number of Black economists and other ethnic groups. 3, arrange for greater participation by Black economists with respect to policy and programming activities within the association. So even back in the late 1969, 70s, the Black Caucus was very focused on the fact that economists were not using their training to influence public policy that at that time when the conversation was so very much Black and white, and I will say to you, in the US, it is still very much Black and white. The majority of the US population and what people would have seen as pensions were Black and white. And so they were recognizing then that the profession wasn't doing a good job with this. And then 4, thought to provide financial support for programs administered by the Black Caucus designed to increase the number of undergraduates. And then 5, they wanted their suggested bill of particulars to be printed in papers and proceedings, and they are. So you can actually go find these in the 1970 papers and proceedings. And what I found to be very interesting about the work of the Black Caucus is the lasting impact of that. And in particular, there is currently a committee that's called the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession. This is a committee that has come out of the caucus of Black Economists, I'm sorry, and their work. And so I often think that, you know, when we're forging forward, and I'm saying ask because it often feels like an ask, and not necessarily that we see it as a right to be in these spaces. We often forget the ways in which we can see the efforts of others. So I really think I think about it, and I'm incredibly concerned about some of the new organizations that I see and how they don't seem to recognize the shoulders of previous organizations that they're standing on. And then in 1970, we have the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession. And one of the things I think that makes CSWEP so very different than many of the other committees of the AAA is that they brought their resolutions to the membership, and the membership voted to have this caucus. And I think that when the membership votes on a resolution, it's a different way of holding the organization accountable than when we're organizing behind the scenes. Now, and that's not to say that I don't value organizing behind the scenes, because again, sometimes I don't think this is about asking people if we can participate. And I often tell my students, right, like co-signing is for loans, not for the things that you want to do. And so if you have a good idea and you've got like-minded folks, many times we forget that we don't need approval from other folks in order to move our ideas forward. And one of the things that CSWEP does, and I think many folks look forward to, is they survey departments to gather information about the representation of women, that faculty rank, tenure status, who's in doctoral programs, and job market placement. One of the things that I'm often disappointed about from these surveys is that they don't ask the question from an intersectional or standpoint. You don't get a sense of how many of these women are non-white women, how many are Black, how many are Asian, how many are Hispanic, how many of them are international. And that's always very troubling for me as we're talking about diversity and inclusion, because it assumes that the experiences of all women are the same, that we are a monolithic group, and that's so not true. Then in 1968, we have the Union for Radical Political Economics, URPE, and URPE's mission was its two primary goals, and one is to promote interdisciplinary approach to political economy and to develop new courses and research areas that reflect the urgency of the day and new values. You'll note that URPE started before the Caucus of Black Economists, and URPE was one of the first organizations to really be pushing against this notion of mainstream economics and wanting more space for a heterodox and Marxian perspective. And again, I'll come back to them. And one of the more younger affinity groups is the American Society for Hispanic Economists, and they were founded roughly in 1999. So in addition to affinity groups, one of the things that I think is incredibly important when we're talking about diversity is this notion of like, how do we measure representation? And so I like this, I'm trying to get this to catch on, this notion of reflective diversity. And that is that organizations are reflective of the populations that they serve. And these are stats looking at women in academia. And I'm going to pause right here and say a lot of our conversation is about the academic space. And that within itself is flawed, because academia isn't the only space where we need to be worried about. There are policy think tanks, there are governmental agencies that often aren't also representative of the populations that they serve. So to just throw that out to say that this conversation about diversity really should be broader than just one about academia. So in 1972, one of the things that CSWEP found out of one of their reports was that women were overrepresented in what we would think about as the non-tenure track positions. 14% of women were instructors, 25% were lecturers, and 24% of women were, and I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. of the instructors, 14% were women. Of lecturers, 25% were women, and 24% of women worked in government. And I believe at that time, women were 8% of the doctoral degree. So if we were to look at the data more recently, one of the things that we can see as we're looking at faculty rank, we tend to focus on the share, i.e. the percent, and not necessarily looking at the numbers. But if we were to separate from the percentages and actually look at the numbers in 2001, and these are faculty who are econ faculty, you'd see something like 89. And when I'm saying a minority, this would be people who identify as Black, Hispanic, Native American, and or other, right? There were only 89, and again, I should say these are women. There were 89 women who had PhDs and were faculty, right? Roughly 1% of all faculty. We jump to 2017, you'll see that number doesn't increase much, right? So if we're looking at Black women, we see 114. If we're looking at Hispanic women, 269 in terms of, and then if you look at other, but if you look in terms of representation, you'll see that representation is 2%. So it's increased. You know what, I guess I should take that back. They think this is whether or not you're a glass half full kind of person, right? Because the representation doubled in 16 years. So if we think that's a good deal, and if you don't, then you understand why I'm saying that, you know, it's slow progress. So in terms of thinking about representation, one of the things that I think is incredibly important is that we disaggregate data so that we can actually see the representation. And even in this data, what I am not showing because it's not available is in the public use data that I'm using is whether how many of the Asian, Black, Hispanic, white, other women are international PhDs versus folks who are permanent residents or U.S. citizens. And I'll say, you know, some may say that doesn't matter, but what we know in the economics profession is about 60% of the degrees that are awarded at the PhD level go to temporary residents. And the reason that is a problem is if we're going to be looking for the pool of folks that we can hire for the Federal Reserve Bank or folks that we can hire in policy think tanks who are going to be shaping in particular American policies, it is of the utmost importance that they understand the American experience. And I am not sure that that's one that you can get as a graduate student. So the other part of why diversity is important is it influences what is deemed as credible research. And what you'll notice on this slide is the various journals that exist to validate the work that marginalized populations, and I mean this both from a race, gender, and ideology perspective, which is another conversation we don't often have about diversity. So we had IRPE's review of radical political economics, and you can actually read that. And one of the things that I'll say that I really appreciated in looking at the history for IRPE was how they explicitly said, look, we've got this journal, and we are going to be validating the work of Marxian economists. We're going to be validating the work of economists who aren't using mainstream, who aren't talking about maximization and utility functions for the sake of maximization and utility functions, and that they recognize that by having this journal and validating these economists' works, it put them in a better position for tenure. And I often think that when we're talking about diversity and we're talking about what's credible research, we talk about it broadly in terms of larger society, but we often forget what it means for the individual and their professional careers. And then I am currently the co-editor for the Review of Black Political Economy. And this was created, it's a journal that was created by Robert Brown to have a space for Black economists. And one of the things that he says about the Review of Black Political Economy that I thought was absolutely amazing was he said, hey, look, this is where you're going to get the ideas of Black economists who are not only trained in economics, but they also live many of the challenges that they're trying to answer. And I was like, yeah, that is so very true. And then 1995, we get Feminist Economics, and I love what Diana Strassman says. You know, it's in recognition of the diversity of feminist thought. The journal will claim no one definition of feminism and will welcome the multiplicity of feminism currently presented in economics, as well as those that may emerge when new voices are drawn into the forum. I don't think there's in many ways, a better statement about the goal of inclusion and recognizing, in particular, that thoughts are going to evolve over time, and for young scholars to know that here is a space to have that work validated. And then more recently is the Journal of Economics, Race, and Public Policy, which examines the intersection of local, global, and issues, and has really more of a focus on replication, like what wants to be a space that when you do work that it actually can be replicated. So as we're talking, from an economics perspective, and we know that economists greatly influence social policies and fiscal policies, it's important to recognize how diversity influences social provisioning. And what I value most about having a diverse profession is what it means for the well-being of marginalized society, that we're more likely to get policies that will take into consideration their experiences. But it also increases agencies. And I like this thought that when you got more diversity and marginalized populations feel agencies, that they're more willing to push against the dominant views of what we may think of as the white upper middle class, and who are also willing to work for change from within the system and not from the outside pushing against. And then the fact that you'll also get increased agency that will empower marginalized populations to question the process. And for me, I really think that that's the value of diversity. And again, Kristen talked about this just in terms of, and Kristen and Smith, Susan mentioned this in terms of the theories that we find acceptable. So one of the things that I've really been pushing for as we're talking about inclusion in the economics profession, but I think this holds for all spaces where we're talking about diversity and inclusion. I think the first one is to have an honest conversation about the definition of diversity. What I find is that in the US in particular, when Black people hear diversity, we think that means more of us. And what we often find is it often means everything but Black. And so I think that that's most important, to have an honest conversation about diversity. And I'm clear. I don't care what your definition is. I just want to know what it is. I want you to have a conversation and establish a definition of diversity, because without that, it is incredibly hard to hold folks accountable, because you don't know what the goal was. And then I also think there needs to be a penalty system for institutions that are not broadening participation. I do think it's time that we stop. There needs to be more stick in terms of what folks are actually doing. And then I'll just close with what I have been really stressing, and that is that a definition of diversity is critical to prioritize the allocation of resources or initiatives or best practices that foster inclusion in the profession, and more importantly, to hold the profession accountable. These are the things that I think that we have not done well. I don't think that in whatever the space may have been, that we have done a good job holding folks accountable. And I'll really finish with this notion I think it's incredibly important that we not confuse diversity with inclusion. I think about, or the way that I have seen inclusion be practiced is it essentially means white males be quiet and allow everyone to speak. And if we are indeed going to have an inclusive space, it needs to be a space where everyone can speak, not just folks who have historically not had a platform to speak. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There is so much to think about there, and I particularly like the discussion you introduced about accountability and that mix of penalties and incentives, and I'm sure we're going to come back to that. Angus has put in a question which he wants to be provocative with, to ask why defining diversity is so difficult. So we'll have that. We're just running a little bit on, but I think it's fine. We've got plenty of space for everyone, and we'll come on to Carolina and then some general questions. But I think you should tackle Angus's question here. Why is defining diversity so difficult?
I think there are a couple. I think the first one is that diversity pivots on different, right? That's how we define diversity. It's the ways in which populations or groups are different. But the challenge with that is and this is the thing that you're not supposed to do. The challenge with that is as we begin to recognize more differences, right? The ways in which we have moved to think about broader racial groups, right? Instead of you just of making folks Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, you can now be multiracial. Instead of asking folks to be a woman or a man or male or female, we allow folks to float between those, right? Not select. So I think those are the part of the reasons why defining diversity is hard. It's not going to be a static definition. It is dynamic. And so it means that you're constantly going to have to keep coming back to what it means to be a diverse population and who you're going to be interested in. And again, I think for every organization, that's going to be different. There's not going to be one definition of diversity, but it is a conversation that you have to have, recognizing that it is a dynamic definition. Diversity is not static.
Yeah, and I hope we're going to come back to that and that whole inclusion, diversity, belonging, that mix of terms, which, as you've said, can quite easily start to appear as if they mean the same thing when they're maybe talking about different practices. So I really welcome that suggestion. What I'm going to suggest, if it's okay, is if we move on to our third speaker in this section, and then we'll have general commentary. Now, to me, the third speaker needs no introduction whatsoever. She's my brilliant colleague, Carolina Alves. She's the Joan Robinson Fellow in Heterodox Economics here at Girton College. I think it's a uniquely named position, and Carolina certainly very uniquely fills that role. She's the co-founder of the Diversifying and Decolonising Economics Group and Initiative, and is going to talk about, picking up on these definitional as well as practical issues, is going to talk about going beyond diversity and making the case for decolonising economics and telling us why that matters. So Carolina, over to you, and then we'll have general discussion at the end of this set of papers. Carolina.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, indeed, a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Susan, for that introduction, and Rebuilding Macroeconomics for having me here, and Carla, of course, for organizing this amazing event. Let me just share my screen, I think. Just 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, I'm kind of really, in a way, I was really happy to be invited anyway, but now after the discussion with Kristen highlighting the question of which scholarship is valued, and Rhonda as well, kind of touching upon the idea of a different ideological perspective when it comes to diversity. So I think my talk actually complements so well what have been discussed up to now. I actually can see that more like applied version of everything that has been said up to now. So I'm really happy to be talking here today. So Yeah, I would, before I start, I should make two observations here. This talk about diversity, decolonization, as Susan has already mentioned, is related to initiative that myself, together with other 9 young scholars, we launched that initiative around almost 2 years ago. And we've been discussing this issue of if you want both, and to go back to Rhonda's point, because it's so amazing, if you want a society that's more inclusive, that is more equitable, and if you want economics, a discipline that can actually deliver that, we have to tackle much more than just the issue of identity representation. We have to open the discipline to the discussion, to other theoretical and methodological approach, and we also have to tackle the question of the Eurocentrism we see in the discipline. So this is actually, Rhonda is one of our advisory board members. So it's a pleasure to hear her and have her as someone who has supported this group since its beginning. So this is a little bit the background of these ideas I've been discussing. So I haven't really developed all of that discussion by myself. Another observation is that because of being involved with that initiative, over a year ago, we've been invited to put a proposal together for a book. Polity Press has approached us, so we did that. So last December, we signed that contract. We've been writing a book on Decolonizing Economics that hopefully would come next summer. And we are 4 authors writing this book, and we're having a great and rich discussion, which also gives the background of what I've been discussing here today. So yeah, I mean, the discussion of lack of diversity in terms of gender and race in economics has actually received increased attention for years, and I think that point has been made by both the speakers before me. And the way I see the events back in March in the US, the killing of George Floyd, have caused the profession, have caused economists to then reflect and think a little bit more than just this issue of representation, and start to question a little bit more the issue of systemic racial inequality in our society. And has been said, I've read about that somewhere else, where it's like if economics is having its Black Lives Matter moment, where the discipline is really challenging different questions now, and that take us to discuss colonialism and the legacy of colonialism, and then this Eurocentric nature of the discipline. So if perhaps before we are kind of focusing on questions such as, what are the benefits of increasing racial and ethnic diversity for the economic profession, or if we're thinking about, how can economics solve its race problem, we see now that these questions, they have been complemented by interesting questions such as, how does economic theories explain racial economic inequality? Is colonialism a major explanation behind today's difference in economic inequality? Or questions such as, how does economics understand the links between racial inequality and systemic racism? And of course, the discussion was there. And to go back to Rhonda's slides regarding some organizations and journals that are trying to tackle these issues, but they have never been central in our discipline. So there is this very particular historical moment now that has allowed us as economists to be very open about that discussion and facing much less resistance than before. So obviously, some of these questions have been approached by other fields, such as history, philosophy, international relations, that are fields that really they came to accept and understand that a lot of the thinking about how the world worked has been formed by worldviews, by assumptions that actually justified colonial rules in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Middle East. But economics, for some reason, has remained silent about that discussion. And unfortunately, economics is not a discipline that's exempt from this kind of knowledge production dynamics that you've seen, that has this worldview. And if we look at the history of economics, and you consider our different schools of thought, from classical political economy to Marxism, neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, yes, we could say, okay, we have a rich and diverse economics, but the reality is that the historical evolution of economics as a discipline has gradually watered down some of the historiographical discussions of capitalism and issues around classes, colonialism, imperialism. And that kind of that neglect also contributed to reduce the diversity of approaches within a discipline. And I'm kind of repeating some of the aspects that Rhonda mentioned before. So in my view, if we are aiming for a more inclusive discipline, a discipline that provides analysis that neither removes the social and historical context or see the economy as this separate entity without considering issues such as related to nature or ethics or power, if we want to challenge that, we need to challenge how knowledge is produced in our field. And that's where, for me, takes part of this discussion is to tackle Eurocentrism. And the way you can do that is really asking the question, do we need decolonizing economics, and what that means and why is important. So the way I see this, one very big step in that process is to try to understand it. That may sounds very obvious, but unfortunately in a state of our discipline right now is not, is to really kind of trying to understand that economics is and has been shaped by the historical and political context in which it has been developing. And I wanted to highlight why this is important in 4 different ways. The first one is this relationship between economics and the development of capitalism. So what I want to highlight here is, this development of capitalism is often described or explained as a period of rationality, as a period of, this technological development that humanity should be very proud about it. And in that kind of understanding of history, the relationship between capitalism development and colonialism, the slave trade, the question of structural racism, they're often ignored or even neglected. And that is the context where we have the language of economics that has emerged as this neutral, objective language that actually conceals these power imbalances, these structural inequalities that we see in society. So we have here this claim to objectivity, where we have these economic laws that's going to function uniformly across different contexts and or political situation. But this naturalization of capitalism can have severe consequence for how we produce knowledge in our field. Just to mention 2 of these consequences, for example, is this the scholarship on the legacy of colonialism and every impact then you would have in development or industrialization, institutions, and distribution of wealth tend to be neglected. Another aspect here is that in that history of the development of the economic ideas, we have, of course, we start with Adam Smith, that is usually, seen to have said that capitalism is the most beneficial way to organize human societies. And I know people would come after me with that statement. However, we have other economists that were writing before Smith.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry, I have my Siri talking to me. So we have, for example, here scholars before Smith that recognize this exploitative foundation of capitalism, and that has been highlighted for contemporary scholars as well. So we need to consider that aspect. The second one is related to that, is this what I see or we see a distorted feel of the history of economics that comes with this kind of biased reading of the history of economic thought. And for me here, the diversity of economic thinking tend actually to get lost in that history of economic thought. So the example that now everybody likes to mention, and I'm going to just echo some of this example as well, is the Arabic scholar Ibn Khaldun that came up with many insights about economics when he was writing in the 14th century, far before Adam Smith, but has never been credited for. There is the question that the mainstream history of economics tends to exclude both the economists from outside the Anglo-Saxon world some of them that were much more influential than the English economists. So if you have time to read Eric Heinert, you can see that. There's also the question of how this mainstream history of economic thought excluded women economists. And here there's the work of Gonçalo Fonseca that you can see that aspect. The third point is the question of this monolithic discipline that really gets to be shaped during the Cold War, and how that reinforce that economics that has become more Eurocentric. And here really, I'm basically looking to the United States, the United Kingdom and the US, and how alternative theories were systematically excluded in universities. The question of URP is an example of how economists will get together to try to survive with a different approach here. And then if you, together with that, we have all these measures of excellence that start being built, where they start shaping also this knowledge production. And here I recommend the work of Danielle Gizzo that's looking at the UK in ref, and you can really see how sometimes this measure of excellence, they can really cause a kind of monoculture in our discipline. And finally, here is the question of the process of globalization itself and the global south, because many curriculums in the global south actually start being shaped or homogenized following what's happening in economics in the US and the UK, and adopting textbooks from these countries at the expense of their own particularities and scholarships. So we have to think about that as well. And the fourth point here is the issue of how these kind of keep going through different channels, from academic gatekeeping, but also even the media. And that is related to the kind of space the media, for example, give to economists, which economists get into to have a voice, or popular books such as Freak Economics that start, it kind of pass as a very specific idea of this Western kind of economics. Global institutions as well were producing or just relying on mainstream economists. And again, this question of the pedagogy of system of research evaluations. So of course, we have much more to talk about here, but I want to just give a taste that is that context actually to kind of take us to really understand what's happening when it comes to Eurocentrism in our own field. And here, together with my colleagues, we kind of argue that there are two main sources for that Eurocentrism. One is actually these economic theories that developed in Europe is actually, they take the European condition as a starting point. This then, because of the Enlightenment and modernity, goes on to become these universal theories, the question of projectivity, and that's how we do economics. And the second aspect related to that is just this scholarship that pertains to Western societies is the scholarship that's valued, and that, to echo Kristen's point here. So, thus diversity is not enough if you don't challenge that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, a little bit more about that. So in that context, of course, the non-Western world, if you want to do well professionally, you really trying to follow these mainstream theories and actually trying to study issues that developed in the West. So yeah, just regarding this last point, I want to recommend that paper, which actually is amazing paper looking to around over 75 papers in economics in 202 top journals. And the findings we have here is that despite this globalized world, the academic publication economics has nothing to do with globalization. I'm not going to mention all of them, but the first one is very telling. Researchers working in countries other than US do get a fair deal of publication top economic journals. Another point in that paper you can see is the finding that between 1985 and 2005, there were more papers about the United States than Europe, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa combined. So that's kind of scary. So what can I say about scientific progress here? And I'm just going to give a very specific example in our field, and that's going to be really my last slide. So if you try to think about this Eurocentrism versus the issue of diversity, what's happening here, as I mentioned before, we have, when you're talking about, for example, the inclusion of non-Western scholars, that can make the field more diverse. But the way, it depends on how we do that. You're really not challenging the Eurocentrism nature of the discipline, which actually sometimes is responsible for perpetuating to keep these scholars actually at the margin. So if you're trying to bring diversity without challenging which kind of scholarship has been discussed and studied around the globe, you may reinforce this Eurocentrism. And so that's why when you're talking about decolonization, or for me, it's a talk about going beyond diversity, because it really, in different ways, you have to reconsider this economics claim of merit and neutrality, universality that comes with this Western idea of economics, Western. So, okay, so just to finalize here, so what can be done? I honestly can't see a different way to trying to tackle this issue in our discipline than why not decolonize the discipline. And we have a very specific meaning here of what that actually means for us. So, and I'm just gonna read here. Decolonizing economics is about breaking the hegemony of the West in the process of knowledge production and creating an academic space where theories grounded in non-Western thoughts are acknowledged as useful starting point. And I hope I'm echoing Kristen here a little bit. And now, of course, in our field, this can become even more specific because we're talking about breaking away from the discipline monolithic mainstream and this claim of universality, objectivity, neutrality. So, I mean, there are different steps the way you can do that, and I'm not going to go through because I separated these slides for discussions. But there is one thing that I want to end my presentation here, which is I've been giving this talk for a while now. And as I said, the profession can be very resistant to that discussion. And it's very, very often economists, they get very upset, thinking that this discussion of decolonizing economics is about calling them, racist or things along that lines, or just, trying to give a space for heterodox economics. And so I added this last slide here to kind of make very clear the point that is what decolonizing economics is not about. And the first one is not about promoting alternative exploratory framework to the mainstream economics, and I hope that was clear when I was going through my talk. Is not really simply studying economics that are excluded. It's not about fighting racism in a discipline or accuse economists in their research of being racist. That's not what decolonizing economics is about. Is, as I said before, is about question and explore the development of the field, how it comes to be represented as a universal and objective science, to question who gets to define it, and to work towards breaking down the intellectual hierarchy that has these colonial roots, and we see that in economics. So yeah, so that's me. Thank you very much.
Oops. Thank you very much, Carolina. That's hugely thought-provoking. I'm going to suggest that all of the panelists come on onto the screen, and maybe would you mind not that's it, stopping the screen share, because I'm sure there's going to be lots and lots of discussion here, particularly well, just a lot of discussion. Let's not say what particularly about, although your approach has raised a lot of questions for me as well, Carolina. So please, people who are watching, and there's quite a lot of you, so do pop some questions into the chat. I think we could start off here with Panka Pramudya's question, which is, there's quite a bit of statement in there, and I think it's really interesting. But the main part of the question is how can we give more voice for researchers from non-Western, non-US, non-core in the economics journals regions? How can we give more voice to participate in internationally diverse research? I think we can all see the question. I hope I've represented it okay, and if Panka, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but if that's if you can pop that in any sort of follow-up into the chat, that would be great. Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
So I'll take a stab at this, and I'm sure Carolina will join on the backside of that. And I think that a lot of this goes to her point about who has, so the question is about who has voice. But I think the other side of that is what I find so often is that the scholars who are on the margins don't actually cite other scholars on the margin, right? And that we actually forget that as scholars, we dictate whose work becomes famous. So Greg Price, who is an economist at the University of New Orleans and a former National Economic Association president, gave, I think in his, get the years wrong, 2008 is what I'm going to go with, presidential address, where he tells, he was telling Black economists, be mindful of who you cite. And I think one of the things that's often left out of this conversation about inclusion in space and voice is that we forget our responsibility to cite other scholars like us and that are in our space. And I think in particular for young scholars, what they tend to do is to cite the big names, and they don't cite the people who are actually doing the work to push the margin. So in the nutshell, my response to that is that we have to be mindful to cite the work that we know by scholars is not getting cited, because citations are for better or worse, that's the metric for validating that your work has value. Right? And then if you do that, I think a lot of the other things will follow. So we need to be responsible.
Can I also just jump in, because this is very quick, and similarly, just to build off what Rhonda said, I mean, I think that white researchers and Western researchers also have an obligation to cite that work. And we often say things like, well, we don't know that literature, or, well, it's incumbent on us to find it, right? And to be using those sorts of materials in classes and our own research. Some of the burden here has to be on people who are benefiting from the system, right? To try to help change it. And languages, I think, which was also brought up in the question, is another thing. But, that's part of the problem, is why is English sort of the dominant language of research? I think that we all have some obligation to take upon ourselves for trying to address some of that.
I mean, I just want to, specifically in our field as well, I think this question of the top 5 journal, we really have to try to tackle that. This is a problem in many different, for many different reasons, but one of them is like young scholars, actually, they trying to reproduce what has been researched there in order to get published, right? And if what has been researched that is one type of economics, or economics looking like 3 or 4 countries, that's what you're going to do to get hired, to get a tenured position. So we need to, in economics, especially when it comes to hiring process as well, we need to find a way to deal with these top 5 journals and how we then assess, especially these young scholars that are coming. And I think this comes to the question of responsibility as well that Kristen mentioned, because recently, and that's some of the good things of Twitter, there was this paper that come by one of the top journals, I think was looking some issue in Thailand, if I'm not right, and there was no Thai author mentioned in that paper. And it was like, I hope I'm not, I think was Thailand. And so, the authors as well, they should be more aware about who they're, citing and bringing their work. And the hiring process, as I mentioned, that's something that institutionally we should try to reveal what we are expecting from candidates, which conference they have to go. For example, for Global South scholars, especially from Latin America, if most of these conferences are conference based in the Global North and speaking English, so we are just out of that hiring process anyway. Or if not, we're going to be talking about a very upper class in Latin America that will be able to then speak that language and get in. Then there's the issue of class as well, clashing with this diversity. So the language is also a problem as well. That is not just translation, right? We need to, there's a discussion about language and knowledge production that needs to be more nuanced than just translate something.
I want to push back a little bit and say that in some ways, I disagree with Kristen about white scholars, right? And not that I don't think that white scholars have a responsibility, But I am so very much over that. Again, my value and my work has to be co-signed. And I know that's not exactly what you're saying, right? But my work has to be co-signed by a white scholar. I think that it is incredibly important for junior folks, as well as senior people who are on the margin. And this goes back to what Carolina says, stop replicating bad behavior, right? I mean, that's just it. We've got to stop replicating. As a co-author of the review of Black Political Economy, and I'm happy to see Gary Dembski in the audience, I have reached out to Gary to mentor a junior person. Now, I have a feeling that the junior person didn't reach back out, but I think it is important for us not to treat people like they would be treated in the broader spaces. And so for me, it is so much, we've got to promote our own. And I'm going to say this, and then somebody, might give me a message in the chat. It is the one thing that I see white women do. They will promote each other and do it in a way that they dare you, as the young folks would say, come for one of theirs. They will rally behind other, in particular, white women. And not to say that they won't rally behind women, but they will really rally behind other white women. And I do think that to me is the key for giving ourselves voice. When we say that scholars who look like us matter, and we're promoting their work, it is hard for the mainstream not to acknowledge.
Yeah, I thank you. Point well taken. I certainly wasn't intending to suggest that, but I see the worry about reinforcing that dynamic. So thanks.
I do remember myself actually feeling just immensely liberated and relieved at some point some years ago, reading that I could write about scholarship and topics as a woman, and I didn't have to do it in defining myself in relation to men, and that you could just think about who women were and what we were doing, and it wasn't a relational thing. And I realise that's a bit old-fashioned way to put it now, but I do remember it being a really liberating moment. So that kind of touched on that bit of memory for me as well. So thanks for that.
So let me actually also, jump in here again and say about language, that I think, hearing you talk about writing about women, right, not in relationship to men, that I think even that word right there, we tend to forget that often when we're talking about women, you're not talking about me and Carolina, right? You're not. And I find that when I ask people to put white in front of women, if that's who you're talking about, oh my gosh, you would think I've asked them for their firstborn. The pushback, it is like, why is that necessary? And again, it's necessary because if you say women and you're not talking about me and Carolina, then you're not talking about women. And we have to recognize in terms of language, not just about English, but that's another way in which language excludes, because you're not talking about all women. Yeah, right? You're just not.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. And because we said we shouldn't feel comfortable this afternoon, and that's absolutely right. Yeah. I was going to go on to another question, but this is a good conversation to have, and a challenging one. Shall we go on to this other one, because it from Holly, I'm not quite sure where this does fit in, but I think Holly's saying here, I think it comes up with Carolina's talk. She's saying something about I guess it's what happens first. Is that really the question, Holly? Would it first be beneficial to get people to address racism or other essentialisms through the lens of classical economics first? So I think she's saying racism in the housing market is a big failure. Do we spend enough time thinking about that when we talk about housing or housing economics? Is that the question? Holly, do qualify if it isn't. Carolina, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, then just finish the... Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to have this kind of hierarchy where we should start to tackling an issue. I think for me, when it comes to economic theory, for me, there's an important methodological issue of how we understand society to tackle some of the issues. For example, when it comes to racial economic inequality in economics, and if you go back to the classical Becker or human capital theory, we know the limitations of that model, and limitations, there are methodological limitations that doesn't see, for example, racism as something systemic and socially produced in society. So it's not about let's tackle racism first. I think in economics there is a problem of we need to review some of our methodological tools to address problems that have been systematically excluded from the discipline when the discipline was moving from this classical political economy to then become this more scientific profession. So if you go through, the formalist revolution, the everything that happens in the last century, the neoclassical synthesis, we have this removal from the social, the historical context, ethics, power. So there's how I can then say what you're going to tackle first if I don't know really my framework, my theoretical and methodological framework. So I think there's this problem. If I understood that. So I think with heterodox economics, I mean, we can't, especially when it comes to my talk, you have to be very careful because some of the heterodox economists are as Eurocentric as the mainstream economists. I'm not saying that, they're as bad as, and I'm not going to dare to start a discussion if Marx was Eurocentric because I don't want to stay here 3 days. But I think there is the question of how we also in heterodoxy start approaching problems where we value scholarships that are also produced in different parts of the globe. I think in the 60s, for example, especially in Latin America, we have this amazing dependency theory school, the structuralist school, and why this has been neglected or moved under the carpet. So that's the expression. So I think there's a question as well of which theory we're dealing, how we value theories that are more local and not one size fits all kind of theory. Yeah, I hope I answered that a little bit.
Yeah, no, thanks for very, very much. I mean, Holly was talking about as well completely new economic theories, but we may get onto those. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee. Anyway, it's an anonymous question, but it's a really important one, which is what recommendations or action points are we suggesting for top editorial boards for thinking about decolonisation and diversity? The gatekeeping potential of the top journals is huge. How do we break into that?
It's funny that question should come about because I have been delinquent in getting together about 4 other editors to have just this conversation where we are talking about what is the role of the editorial board. Is it gatekeeper? Is it a shepherd? Is it mentor? Right? Because we sort of see, and I think most of us think of that the role of the editorial board is to one to be a shepherd and a mentor and not a gatekeeper. So I would say that the first steps are really to re-educate editorial boards about what their roles are and stop having them see themselves as gatekeepers, right? They should be shepherding forward ideas that advance the profession, not stopping ideas that don't align with theirs, right? And I think that if we can get editorial boards to make that switch in ideology, and for us to make that switch in terms of how we see them, right? And if we do that, then when our expectations change from them being gatekeepers to being shepherds, then I think you'll see a good deal of change for an editorial board. So for example, FM Econ, they already, when articles come in that need work, right? Could be a young scholar, someone, Holly mentioned, was it Holly? No, Panka asked about language, what they are doing because it is a journal that is in English. When articles come in and they need more work, they already have a practice of assigning them with a mentor to usher them through their process. But I think that's again about them recognizing and having a commitment to have a diversity of ideas presented in their journal. So I'm going to wrap that up by saying I think the idea is for us to change our perspectives about them in terms of being gatekeepers, and that they should be shepherds and mentors, and then hold them accountable to our expectations about being shepherds of ideas through the profession, and then to mentor people through the process.
I think it's a great idea. I'm curious if anyone's got any ideas about how to make that work in practice. How are you going to engage with them?
Well, we're actually, once I can get, I don't know about anyone else, but COVID has me far more busy than I ever was. So hopefully after Thanksgiving break, we're going to get back together. And what we're doing is we're writing an article about the expectations and what folks should be doing, and what we're already seeing out as best practices that do this. Right? Because we know that in our profession, the way that you get academics to change is you write about it and you get it published, and then it's cited, and then they will take it as valid. It's not just enough for you to actually be doing and be successful. It's not valid until it's published someplace in a journal. So that is our goal, is to the five of us to come together to write about it and then send it off to get published. And then hopefully that will be the beginning to have these conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, I of course I don't have much experience on the editorial aspect of all this, but I do agree with this point on the gatekeeper aspect, and I think so. I mean, there are many studies now showing, for example, as I mentioned before, the question of the US-EU dominance. There's in the last econometrics annual conference. There was, again, a study showing how the scholarship look into race and racism in economics less than 1%. So we have evidence of things that are not happening in these journals. So in economists, they love evidence. So, I mean, you need policy now. And I know people don't like the word affirmative action, but I think a lot of these editorial boards now, they should come with some policies that is literal affirmative action. How many papers we have in the US in the last year? So, well, we have to find a balance here now. Or how many papers have discussed equilibrium or whatever? No, let's give space to papers discussing race. I can't see why we can't do that as in terms of affirmative action kind of perspective as well.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I think one of the challenges that we have to thinking about what policies or changes might work in practice is that even some journals don't do a good job of collecting the kind of data that we might like to be able to evaluate some of these things. So, what's the gender makeup of reviewers? What's the racial makeup of reviewers? What's the citizenship of reviewers? Like, I mean, these are, a lot of journals don't even collect that data. And then in some cases, even if they have it, they may not want to share it. But, so not having some of that data makes it a little bit harder to see exactly what's happening in ways that we could correct it. So I think even that as a practical change of starting to collect this kind of data would be also helpful in a small way, at least.
Because the other thing that worries me that we haven't got time to talk about is the increasing automation of the editorial role. So that in fact, in a very crowded world, in a very crowded journal, the editor actually might have rather little, they're just driving a machine. And I think there are some, interesting issues worrying issues that arise from that too. Look, we're running out of time, surprisingly enough. There is just one question I thought we should just handle, and then we might just lead the time a little bit. But a little earlier on, someone asked about STEM subjects and mentioned that a few of us had mentioned STEM subjects a few times. And we're saying that the impression is that in the UK, at least, I don't know if this is true elsewhere, the STEM subjects have been trying to diversify a lot longer than the economics discipline. Can we learn anything from them is the question.
I mean, so it is true that also in the US that, I mean, millions of dollars of grants and lots of research has gone into trying to address diversity and inclusivity in STEM. Little progress, honestly, has been made. And, sort of as Rhonda said, the people who have largely benefited from that is white women. So, I mean, I have lots of ideas about, there's certain things that universities are trying to do, at least in the US, everything from trying to make hiring decisions in cohorts, right? So that you try to bring in a group of new scholars together, so that they don't feel like tokens or alone, or you know, some of those practices, changes in mentoring, changes in P&T, having more family. I suspect we have worse family policies in the US than in the UK. But you know, things like having your tenure clock automatically stopped for certain things, and having it not just be about having children, but also for things like taking care of other people in your family. So, I mean, I think there are some policies that that you know can help, but I think part of the problem, and one common thread I think I heard through all of our talks here, is this idea that we actually really have to think hard about what diversity is, what is the goal, what's the aim, before we can have a more successful account of what we do, how we get there. And I think that has actually also been lacking in STEM fields, sadly.
So I come to economics through mathematics. Most of my training is in math, and at the PhD level, I am an interdisciplinary PhD, math and econ. And I am just recently connecting back with my math folks. And I can say to you, I don't hear the conversations still that I hear in econ. Right? I don't hear these conversations about hostile spaces in the same way that I hear them in econ, both in the social sciences and in the humanities. But I would say that for me, and again, what I've been saying to folks as they're talking about STEM, is the narratives have to change. So much of the conversation about these spaces is how hostile they are. And if anyone has been paying attention, millennials and Gen Zs, they're not having it. They're not coming in spaces to be treated poorly. We see it in the way that you recruit them in tech space. And if you go to any of these tech companies, you will want to quit your job and just be like, yes, hire me right now, because they've got so much like cool stuff. I think that if we want people to come in these spaces, it is great to talk about the challenges, but the challenges have to be put in more positive frames. We have to have people who are talking about good experiences. I had a great experience as a grad student in economics. I wasn't hazed. I wasn't hazed as a woman in mathematics. I had always been either taught by women or taught by Blacks. I know that is rare, but that's my experience, right? I don't know the hazing in grad school, nor as a faculty member, but I don't know it in grad school, either in econ or in mathematics. I had always been taught by people who looked like me until I was 26, right? And so I think that the narratives have to change, because if they don't, it's not going to matter how much money you're putting in here. When they start talking to people who had negative experiences, that's going to be enough for them to alter their path, right? So it would behoove us to find people, or at least find the good in the experiences that we've had and start to talk about.
I just have a quick point regarding the narrative as well, but in terms of which stage we're talking about, because one thing I've seen in the UK as well is that actually the amount of women applying for economics has also been decreased since the 70s, and I think it goes towards a lot of what Rhonda said about this hostile environment. The idea is why that's happening, because when they're having this discussion, of course you can say, okay, STEM has has done much more to bring women in, or other minorities in, and economics hasn't done enough. But there's also the question why people are not even, women do not even feel more attracted to apply for economics like before. What's happening here? There are different explanations, and there are authors tackling that issue, which is not just about the hostile environment, but the question that why economics is particularly complicated when it comes to diversity in terms of gender and race. I think this is a discussion we need to start asking as well, in terms of how we're attracting applicants to our field.
Yeah, super. We're going to have to pull up the ladder, which is a shame, because this is a fantastic discussion, and we've got more to add to it after the break. But for the time being, Rhonda Sharp, Carolina Alves, Kristen, Interman, thank you so much for a really stimulating discussion. It's left us all with a lot to think about, and hope you'll come back if you can and join us in the next section. People on the call, we're going to have 5 minutes break. So wherever you are, it's something 45, and we're going to come back at something 50. If you can stay on the call, that's absolutely great. But in the meantime, thanks for this really great part of the afternoon. Thank you. Anyway, we should move on to the next part of the
we should.
Proceedings, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So we've got two speakers in this session, Arun Advani and Felicia Odammten, and we're going to. I think I'm going to take the papers together. Is that okay, Arun and Felicia? And then we'll have the discussion in the round afterwards. So. Arun Advani is the Assistant Professor in the Economics Department and Impact Director of the Cage Research Centre at the University of Warwick, and co-chair of Discover Economics, a campaign to increase the diversity of people who study and work in economics. Also on the Economics Board, Editorial Board, important role, Editorial Board of the Economics Observatory. And Arun's going to talk to us about what are the obstacles to increase the diversity of people studying and working in economics and what to do about it. So that's a huge question, and we've got about 15 minutes and really look forward to hearing something of the answer. Thanks, Arun.
Thanks. So yeah, I should set expectations by saying that, you know, there are clearly lots of things that need doing, and this is going to be a very limited discussion of a subset of those things. But I think it would be useful to, I think, set the stage a bit to just understand, particularly in the context of the UK, where this is sort of set up, what diversity looks like in economics at the moment, and what some of the challenges are. And then I'll talk a bit about Discover Economics, which is something that with Sarah Smith, who's at the University of Bristol, I co-chair, which is a campaign to try and increase diversity in economics. I should also say thank you. I'm in the unusual and privileged position of being the token man on the panel, so that's a nice change for once. So the first thing I think is just it's useful to set the stage for the context of UK academia as a whole. So this is nothing to do with economics yet, but just looking at what academia in the UK looks like. And so what we've put here, so coming to kind of the point that, so what we've got here is looking at these yellowy orange dots. It shows you the share of different groups that are in the population. So what share of the population report having a mixed background, Indian background, Pakistani background. Because it would be the obvious comment that Rhonda would make, we in a version that's online have a white group as well. We only miss it from this graph because white people are by far the majority, and if you put them on this graph, all the other bars look too small to read anything, so they're excluded from this graph. So it shows you for all of the minority ethnic groups what share they are in the population of England and Wales. Those are the yellow dots. And if academia as a whole were representative for all these different ethnic groups, then each of these bars should be basically the same height as that dot. And if there was an equal gender split, then each of these bars should be half red-pink and half blue-green. And what you can see is two things. First, you can see very clearly that there's a mix of over and underrepresentation, depending on where you look. So particularly individuals from Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and different Black backgrounds are all underrepresented. Individuals from Indian and Chinese backgrounds are overrepresented. And the other thing is that for most ethnic groups, and this is also true for a white ethnic group, but they're excluded from this graph so that you can see things, women are underrepresented. So they're sort of slightly underrepresented. If you look in the mixed or the Indian groups, they're much more underrepresented, very, very drastically underrepresented if you're looking at Pakistani, Bangladeshi backgrounds. Actually, among Black Caribbeans is the one group where they're overrepresented relative to men, although individuals with Black Caribbean background are very underrepresented in academia as a whole. But I think of that as a useful set of kind of clearing the decks to help us think about what the kind of context is that UK economic academia sets itself in. I should also say that very clearly, I should have said this at the top, I'll talk mostly about economics in the context of academia. That's not because I think academic economics has some special role beyond all of the other important things that economists do in society. I mean, I think economics in that sense is important, because although not everybody likes us, and I take the point that came earlier that, you know, economics is too important to leave to economists. But in practice, I mean, the government economics has the government has a government economic service. Felicia is in fact a member. It doesn't have a government geographic service or a psychological service or a sociological service. So it's not to say whether or not it should, but just as a matter of practice, economists do end up in these kind of roles that are important in the sense that they have some power over the rest of society. And so it is important to think, how are we representative or not of the rest of society? Because I mean, if not, both in terms of the experiences we have and therefore what kinds of ideas we can think about and have some experience to speak about, but also from the purpose of being kind of credible to the rest of the population when we start making policies and having ideas. How does everyone else feel about that if we look very different? However, having said all of that, I won't be able to talk about anything really beyond academia for the reason that despite our best efforts, we couldn't get data from the Society of Professional Economists, nor from other private institutions, nor from the Bank of England or anyone similar. So we don't have data outside of academia. So how does academia look compared to, economic academia look compared to academia as a whole? Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, we actually are not that underrepresentative. In some cases, we're overrepresentative of particular minority groups relative to what one might expect. So this black dashed line across here shows you the share of all academics in the UK who are economists. So it's about 2.3% of all academics in the UK are economists. And if we were kind of equally representative of all sexes, of both sexes, and of all, I should say, we also, the data that we have only have male and female as sex categories, so we can't say anything about other groups. But so for the two sexes that we have access to, and for the set of different ethnic categories that are available in the data, you can see that in some cases we're actually overrepresentative of some groups, in some cases clearly underrepresentative. But in that sense, you know, economics doesn't look bad compared to academia as a whole, and you can read that in one of two ways. Either you can say, look, we're not doing too badly, academia's kind of whatever it is, but we are representative of academia, and so, you know, we're not doing too bad in that sense. On the other hand, as I showed you in that previous graph, that's a sort of misleading picture because academia as a whole isn't doing well. And so, you know, it shows the kind of challenge that we have in the UK of doing something about this, because academia isn't doing well, and so we'll be fighting against the tide of the rest of the university sector around us. But it's important that we think about what we can do to kind of deal with these issues. The other thing to say, so in the UK, there are this set of sort of top-ish universities that define themselves as top universities, the Russell Group, and they are the most research-intensive universities. That's where the kind of stuff, what kind of work gets done that publishes in top journals, and whatever you think about top journals, if you are going to have an impact on kind of policymakers, there is some extent to which being able to say, oh, well, we're published in these top places is important. And therefore being in institutions where you have the time to work on research and think about these kinds of questions, even if you're not going to publish in top journals, being an institution where you have the time to work on research and think about these questions is really valuable. So what we show here is first among all academics. So the blue bars show you among all academics what share are in the Russell Group. So if you look in the white category, you can see a bit less than half of all academics are in this top set of universities that are research intensive. And then when you look across the board, you can see kind of similar heights for those blue bars, except in the case specifically of the groups we identified earlier, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Black individuals. I should say here we've had to group Pakistani and Bangladeshi. We've also grouped all the different categories of Black individuals. That's not because we think of them as homogeneous, it's because they are actually so few in this context that for reasons of disclosivity, we're not allowed to show you what it would look like if we broke them out. So we've had to group them together. In economics, there's a slightly higher probability of being in the Russell Group. Economics isn't taught in a lot of universities. So there's the orange bar, say, for the white group is a bit higher. And you can see it's kind of similar, again, for many of the other ethnic groups. But you can see that for Pakistani and Bangladeshi individuals and for Black individuals, who are the ones who are already underrepresented in the top, in these sort of research-intensive universities, among economists, they're even more underrepresented. So even in a context in which we say, well, we don't look too bad compared to the rest of academia in our representation of individuals from different ethnic backgrounds, particularly for these categories, so Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Black individuals, we are doing very badly at having them represented in the institutions where research really takes place. So why does that even matter? Some of this has been touched on earlier, but I think Caroline actually mentioned some of this work that we've been doing that was presented at the Econometric Society conference. But just to give you a sense for like how much do economists then think about issues in terms of the research they're doing that is race related. So this is not a UK specific thing. This is looking at just the share of all research that economists produce that is race related. And we in our wider work, we've compared it to a few other benchmarks. Here, for simplicity, I've just taken one other group. We're comparing us to sociologists. So they are also a group of people who are interested in society, interested in some of the same kinds of questions as us in principle, although obviously with a very different set of techniques to study these questions. And we look at what's the share of research that we're producing and the share of research that sociologists are producing that is in some sense race related. We categorize this using a kind of computational approach, so that we can, we obviously can't read all 20-odd thousand papers that have been produced over this period. So what we do instead is to use a kind of computer to help us do it and to do some validation by hand to double check it. The dashed lines give you a sense for, depending on how bad you think our computer algorithm is, this is sort of the range you could fall in. But even with the kind of the worst case for sociology and the best case for economics, we're still a long way apart in terms of the share of research we're producing. And I think that what I find kind of striking, looking at the numbers on how much research economists have been producing on issues of race, you realize that the total amount of research, the total kind of sum total of what we've produced in economics today, means that we've produced about, even though we publish more articles in total than either political science or sociology in any given year, we are in the sum total of knowledge, contribution to knowledge that we've produced. It's sort of where political science was in the 90s, or where sociology was in the 1980s. So we are, decades out in terms of our time spent and sort of production of work in this area. You can also see this when you look at the top journals. So this is, that top 5 that Carolina mentioned that, economists love. We all want to publish in these journals. This is showing you sort of over time the number of papers that they've published that are somehow related to race. And the cumulative count, if you add up all of the articles published in any of the top 5 in all of history since they started, there's a bit less than 200 articles that they published that in any way touch on issues of race. The top journal in sociology on its own, American Journal of Sociology, reached that total in 1970. So we're 50 years behind across the top 5 put together. The American Sociological Review reached that target in 1987, so 30-something years ago. So, on this question of why does it matter, one of the reasons it matters is that, there's obviously this interplay between, who is in economics and what they choose to study. And that goes both ways in the sense that if you, putting aside what Rhonda said, that what we'd like is for editors perhaps to be more like shepherds than like gatekeepers. To the extent that editors are gatekeepers, they may not be interested in this kind of research, and that damages the prospects of getting people in who think they can't study the topics they're interested in. But not having people, not having a diverse group of people coming in means that these kinds of topics are not being studied. So that is quite important to think about. We also don't know about this. There's a sense in which you could say, well, okay, maybe economists are just aware of this. They don't mind. They think it's totally fine that we're not spending time working on this stuff. We just think it's not important. So we did some kind of prediction work talking to, ran a survey of economists to look at what they understood about all of this. So they get it right in terms of thinking that sociologists probably produce the most research in this area, political science a bit less, and economists yet less. That's the left-hand graph. Those colored boxes show you sort of the range of predictions that people gave, the 10th percentile, the 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th. And our best guess of the 10th percentile, so 90% of economists overestimate how much we produce. They think we produce more than we actually do. Their median guess is something like 7 or 8% of our research is somehow race related. So I'm not quite sure what they're reading to get that number, but it's, as I showed you, about 2%. We also, when we look at the sort of time trends, we, on the right-hand bar, we seem to think it's getting better. It's been improving, and it has been improving, but just not at the rate that we seem to think it has. And clearly we're producing much less research in this area than we currently think. So that's, all in a sense, I've used up most of my time to tell you a whole load of background, but I think it's important to just sort of see where we are and see what the kind of facts on the ground are. As in fact, I think all of the speakers mentioned, economists are quite driven by numbers and thinking about, what can we see in the world? What are the numbers? What do they tell us about what's going on? So I think it's important to highlight these kind of facts because they help us see what we are doing, and only once we see that and recognize that can we think about change. I mean, there's a real, in the language of economists, there's real information problems in trying to understand what the situation is right now, because we all have our sort of narrow views on the world. And so I think documenting this is kind of important. So just to sort of get towards a bit of an end on this, it would be interesting to know where, I think it's important to know how much of this is going to change. And so one thing, this is now focusing on only on the ethnic minority work and not really talking about women as I did at the top, just for the kind of time that we have available. What you can see is actually most of undergraduate study in the UK is increasing its ethnic minority share. Economics is that reddish bar and reddish line in the middle there. We're doing less well than finance and accounting, although we're increasing at a similar kind of rate. STEM was one of the questions that was asked earlier. I mean, STEM has been spending a lot of time talking about these issues, the science, technology, engineering, and maths. They're a lot worse than we are, despite that. And so are the social sciences generally. So in that sense, I'm glad that that they've also recognised to some extent that there is a problem. But in line with what Rhonda said about the sort of not seeing the discussions among mathematicians, we haven't seen that there's been kind of a faster growth in undergraduate representation in those fields than we see in economics, particularly. But again, coming back to this question of like who progresses, where do we see these undergraduates going? Here, what we've done, for good or for bad, is to take white as the benchmark and say, okay, let's look at the share of white students who end up in the Russell group for all subjects and for economics specifically. So it's the blue for all subjects, the orange for economics specifically. What you can see, again, sort of similar to what we have seen before in terms of the patterns, the groups that are really underrepresented in these sort of top flight universities, the places where you're likely to go on to do further research work, where you're likely to go on to get into government jobs, to get into these kind of top things where we need to see more people, a more equal representation. The groups that are underrepresented in the UK still are Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and individuals from various Black backgrounds. And so I think this, what I've done is mostly to show you a whole range of challenges that we have, a whole range of areas where we see problems. Because there are so many, I think there's kind of more than any single organization can do. I, with Sarah Smith, set up Discover Economics, which is a campaign specifically to try to increase diversity in economics, focusing at the undergraduate level. So trying to focus on getting more people into undergraduate economics, getting people in from a more diverse range of backgrounds. One thing I should say is, diversity to us has a number of different dimensions that we're interested in. We are interested in thinking about the male-female diversity. We're interested in thinking about diversity in terms of ethnicity. We're also interested in socioeconomic status. So it's something we haven't really covered, I haven't talked about today, but it is really important. I mean, a big part of the reason that students don't get into undergraduate economics is because they don't have access to economics at school in any form. If you don't have an A-level, if you don't have access to A-level in your school, and more than half of schools don't, then you're very unlikely, less than 1% chance that you go on to study economics at university. If you studied A-level at school, there's about a 1 in 4 chance you go on to study at university. So access to the A-level is hugely important, and it varies a lot by school type. So state schools of the kind of conference of variety, there's a far lower chance of having access to A-level economics, and therefore far lower chance of going on. And that partly shows up because you sort of see this. What we can pick up more directly is, you see differences in ethnic diversity, but that doesn't capture the fact that even among the, say, white individuals who you see going through, they're much more likely to come from private school backgrounds or from the sort of grammar school or former grammar school backgrounds, which are the kind of better, as it were, state schools. So it is really important to think about these other dimensions of diversity. And the final one in the UK is regional diversity, because again, we actually know that London and the southeast and the big cities are actually much overrepresented in economics, and so that's another issue. And that's partly, from conversations we have with students or potential students. I had someone who said to me, "Look, I'm from a small town in the west of the UK, and what I see in economics is that when I'm done, the only job I can have is going to be in London. If that's the case, and I'm going to have to live, many hours from my family, I'm not going to be able to see them easily. That's not a thing I want to do. That's a reason for me not to become an economist, because there's no job near me." And so some of the work we've been doing has actually been showing that there are, looking into what kinds of jobs there are and trying to do a better job of actually showing the range of things economists actually go on to do, the range of areas that we work in. That's part of what we're doing in the Discover Economics campaign. Part of what we're doing is going into schools. Well, what we were doing before COVID, now we're trying to do it virtually, is going into schools to try to interact with students directly in places where they don't have access to the A-level economics, to give them an idea of what economists do, what kinds of jobs you can get, why it's an interesting field to go into, and to try to kind of attract them to become economists, and to sort of just provide more information about what's going on. So I'll leave it there in terms of what we're doing, what we think is one of the key challenges, and what we're doing to try and solve it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Aaron. What I'm going to propose to do, if that's okay, because I think these two parts of discussion really are closely linked, I'm going to go straight on to a discussion of the fact that racial diversity in economics matters. And I'm going to ask Felicia Odammten to talk to us about that. She's the founder and director of the Black Economics Network, and that's a UK-based network with a global footprint that connects, supports and inspires Black economists while challenging the lack of diversity in the field. Felicia is also a fast-stream economist in the UK civil service. So it would be great to hear a bit more about this topic of racial diversity in economics and the fact that it matters. Thanks, Felicia.
Well, thank you for that. So yeah, I'm just gonna get straight into it and why I think racial diversity matters for economics. So there's been no doubt that 2020 has been a real eye-opener in terms of racial relations in Western societies for everyone. COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on Black communities, as well as coupled with the fact that the terrible killing of George Floyd has been a painful reminder to all that racial injustices and inequalities exist, and they are persistent. These events have caused us to reflect on why racism, like what racism is in all its forms, whether it's structural, institutional, overt or covert, and how it manifests throughout our society, and how racial diversities occur at every level in every field, including economics. The fact that there exists a huge lack in diversity in the field, it means that it's unsurprising that there are persistent racial inequalities in economic outcomes, which is prevalent and not explored enough by economists, which Aaron kindly showed us through his really nice graphs. So as it stands, economics is not very racially diverse. And a quick Google search of some of the top held economics positions from think tanks to banks really show that. So I was doing a bit of digging. Here are some key stats, which I think we've already covered as well, but I'll just put them out there to reiterate the point that in the whole entire history of economic Nobel Prizes, out of 86 winners, there's only been one awarded to a Black economist. This was all the way in 1979. That was way before I was born. And that was Arthur Lewis. And in the US, there is a declining percentage of econ degrees awarded to Black students. In the UK, as Aaron has shown, like ethnic minority economists who do work in Russell Group universities are 45% less likely to hold a professorial or managerial job compared to their white counterparts. And of those who passed the fast stream, the economics fast stream that I'm on, which is the UK Civil Service Accelerated Grad Programme to become a government economist, only 8% of ethnic minority candidates ended up receiving a job offer compared to 22% of white candidates. So these stats actually paint a picture of how terrible diversity is in economics, but increasing diversity in economics isn't just about representation, it's about inclusivity of perspectives, experiences, and adopting different approaches. So economics theory isn't sufficient in tackling racial inequality or racial issues. Put very simply, much of what we understand about the economy, how it operates, is based on mainstream neoclassical economic principles, which focus on this idea of rationality, self-interested agents whose behavior is defined to maximize some kind of utility subject to some kind of constraint. And therefore, put really simply, any discrimination is usually treated as just a revealed set of preferences of agents trying to maximize their behavior. And in the case that it is seen as irrational, this argument is that it can just be competed away. So this framework and how the economy operates underneath it is presented as if it's objective, unbiased, and non-ideological. The problem is that the free market doesn't deliver equitable outcomes, but it rather reflects behaviors, norms, group identities, ideologies that seek to uphold policies and institutions that can be deemed as racist. So to quote Joel Gamble, racism is a system that manifests in norms, institutions, and policies. When economic analyses fail to account for these institutions, they perpetuate racist outcomes. And though these mainstream assumptions embedded in neoclassical theory are becoming increasingly contested by pluralist economists and other scholars, this is still taught in introductory economics courses. It's still pushed by politicians and leaders. And most importantly, it's still used to form the basis of many business decisions and inform public policy. Economists hold some of the most important positions in society, with the ability to form policies that can change people's lives, but the extent to which they can change lives for the better is dependent on the evidence and the analysis underpinning them, and those and whose perspectives are being included. So a lack of attention to issues faced by particular communities can lead to poor decision-making in policy and negative outcomes for some of these communities. So how can we as economists try to improve this and help? So as recent events have sparked conversations amongst professionals and academics about racism and economics, me and members of the network have been talking about how we would like the economics community to be better allies to Black economists. And they summarized their views in 4 key points, which I'm going to share. So one, we spoke about increased visibility. So the visibility of Black economists and their work is key. Actively seeking out economists to speak at events, write articles, commentate on a range of economics issues, not just race. The field needs to amplify Black economists as well as economists from other backgrounds. And we need to start seeing ourselves in the contributions that we make. So this touches on to the point where, you know, I think Arun was talking about someone who said they didn't want to study economics because they'd be far away. So then they don't see themselves in that profession. It's the same for maybe someone who was born in London from a culture where economics is just so far away. They see the field as just white men in suits who work in a city, and they're like, oh, I don't see myself in that. I don't see anyone that looks like me, so I'm not even going to consider joining the field. And obviously that helps to keep the field less diverse. And that leads on to the second point that we spoke about, which was increased relatability. So this is about hosting seminars, events, even carrying out research, which makes economics less foreign and isolating. If the goal of economics is to increase diversity and be inclusive, then the material that the field produces must also have a more relatable, must be more relatable to the Black experience. But again, that can work for Asian, for lower socioeconomic, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. The third point we moved on to was talking about increased support. So things like donating and just amplifying the work we do. This involves partnering to deliver events, talks, workshops, and various different initiatives such as mentorship and training programs. And that leads on to the final point that we spoke about, which was increased opportunities. So by supporting potential and current Black economists through the pipeline, such as funding, creating targeted outreach programs to introduce economics as a viable option for Black students, and offering opportunities for paid training programs, internships, and work experiences for aspiring economists. We as a network, we're really proud to have a platform that's committed to supporting Black economists and amplifying their voices. We encourage these conversations being sparked across the field about fighting racial injustices. And most importantly, we really call on different economic organizations to act. It's not enough to just acknowledge the problem. What we're calling for is that there's action is actually taken. So to conclude that section, I think it's important that economics, economists have a role to play in the action for change to help build inclusive systems that benefit all. This is because the policy recommendations that are made are dependent on the evidence and analysis, and it's really important whose perspectives are being included. And so a lack of attention to issues justified by certain assumptions can ultimately lead to poor decision-making and negative outcomes for certain groups, which we're already witnessing. So in summary, that's why race matters for economics. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say in terms of what I have to add. Oh, I think you're muted, Susan.
So thanks very much. I mean, I wonder if Arun would like to kind of come back onto the screen, and perhaps we could have a little bit of Q&A around these two presentations, and then we could have a bit more wrap-up discussion at the end. The audience attendees are very quiet because we haven't got anything in the chat at the moment. So do we have any questions or commentary on the two presentations we've already had, or perhaps from some of the other panelists? I see that Rhonda and Carolina are still here, sort of linking some of the conceptual background that you were talking about to some of these practical steps that we've got here. Would anybody like to come in with some comments or questions? Carolina.
I mean, I think it's, I just would like to comment, I think it goes for both presentation, about the question of diversity, especially in the UK, and how to, the procedure to then apply for economics in the UK, and then how to attract a more diverse group, and how that actually it crossed the issue of you know, classes in the UK, in the schools, and which kind of A level you have access. And there's an interesting work has been done by the economy.org, I think. They also look into that in terms of something that Felicia said, how actually, you know, many youngsters, they just don't identify with being an economist because of that city image. And then on the top of that, something that Arun mentioned before, they don't even have the qualification they need to apply. And I think this is interesting because in Cambridge, we face that kind of challenge. We want to be inclusive, but there's also this question of the A levels we need to then perform well. Doing economics here, it would be the A level in math, or, you know, or in further math. I mean, how many schools in the UK, they are able to offer further math for these students to then be prepared to apply for university. So I'd like to, so I'd like just both of you to expand a little bit more on this issue of class and diversity, or race and class, and the question of intersectionality that, I know for me is a big deal. I never know how to deal with that properly.
So I've got, I guess, two things to say on that. So one, in terms of intersectionality, I think one of the things that I find interesting in the UK that's definitely different from the discussion in the US in academia, the pattern for ethnicity and the pattern for sex are really quite different. So for sex, the problem as it were in the UK is a small pipeline. There are very few women who come into economics at the undergraduate level. So about one in three undergraduates is female, rather than sort of 1 in 2 is the obvious benchmark. But once you get women in, they're as likely to carry on to study at the master's level, to study on at the PhD level, to go on and become assistant professors. Not that that's the only thing you should do as an economist. There is a drop off at the full professorial level, and that's still something that definitely needs addressing. But actually, the big barrier, and that's sort of partly why we started off thinking about the kind of step between school and undergraduate, is getting women into economics altogether. For ethnicity, it's a very different pattern. So actually, people with Indian background, like myself, are like massively overrepresented at the undergraduate level. That's not true, obviously, for all ethnic minority backgrounds, but it's true certainly for Indians. But then we drop out really quickly relative to, so if you take whites as a sort of benchmark, since they're the majority group, relative to that, people with Indian backgrounds are much less likely to go on to further study in economics. And so it's a very different pattern, and that's kind of true across all ethnic minority groups. They're not all overrepresented at the start, but they're all much less likely to go on to further study than white individuals are. And so there's clearly a separate set of challenges that need dealing with there. So that's in terms of the intersectionality. I think there's quite important differences as well as kind of common threads. In terms of this sort of issue of schools and A levels, so I mean, one of the things I think that for me is interesting as an academic, as someone who works at a university and thinks about, well, what do we need for our students to have when they come in? We don't ask them. It's great if they have economics. We don't require them to have economics at A level. There's no evidence they do any better if they came with A level economics than if they don't. By the end of term one, all our students have caught up. It doesn't matter whether or not you had A level economics. Maths is really important, but actually the real driver in terms of getting students to have the information, to have some idea of what economics is about, whether or not you like the set of things we currently study, to have some idea of what you currently could be studying at university, and therefore, might make you tempted to go into it. It's really important whether or not you had access to A-level. So even though we think of the A-level won't give you any magical skills that are really important for you at university, and therefore we tend to say, and most universities will say, we don't require the A-level in economics. That's actually kind of, in a way, absolving ourselves of responsibility for having to deal with the fact that most people out there don't have access to the A-level, and so and those who don't have access to the A-level are very unlikely to come in the first place. And so we do actually need to think about those students who don't have access to A-level in the first place.
Thanks, Arun. Felicia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess I'd say in terms of the intersections between class and, trying to get into economics, I think part of the issue and some of the barriers, not only is it just, people needing the requirements for maths and economics, and there are issues in that as well, because I remember when I was doing A-levels and I had a rubbish year at maths for one of my A-levels, and my maths teacher told me not to take a maths to the next level, but I knew I could do it, but so I continued. However, imagine so many other kids at that level, and maybe there's a bit of bias, a little bit of racism, where they've been told that they shouldn't be able, they're not able to achieve certain things to even aspire to become an economist. So I think that also, those like more insidious ways which put people off from even trying to do better. If you don't have a good support network or the pipeline that encourages that, then it's difficult. Then on top of that, you've got to take maths, further maths. Yeah, that's terrible. And I also wanted to add that it's not just at the level of what I found with the network is not just at the level of entry, but we've had loads of opportunities for some of our members to actually amplify their voices, but a lot of the engagement from our members have been low. And at first I thought, oh, isn't this what we want, guys? Like, come on, we've got opportunities. But then I did a little bit more digging and asking people, and I found out that people, even though they've got the qualifications, they still don't think they're good enough, which is really heartbreaking, actually, because it tells me and it tells us that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of building the confidence up of Black economists who don't even think that they fit into the field that they're actually in, which to me is crazy. I mean, I'm still personally trying to work on it, but then, it's a wider issue as well. But yeah.
Can I just mention something very quickly about math as well, to follow a little bit Felicia, because I think probably Arun has that data. I looked into that 2 years ago in the UK. It's interesting to kind of also break away from that myth about math and women and Black people, because at least in the UK, we have much more diversity in math, in undergraduate mathematics and statistics than economics. So women and other minorities are doing much better in math and statistics, or even other hard sciences than economics. So it is important to highlight that as well.
And I'd also chime in and say in the US, it's one of the things that I've been saying for years. If you look in particular at the PhD level, everybody gets more PhDs in math and statistics than they do in economics. Unfortunately, and I think I put this in the chat, my 2018 presidential address points out that not only are Black women in particular not pursuing the undergraduate degree in economics, but they're also not doing it in math. What we haven't seen yet is that there has been an impact in terms of the PhDs that are being awarded. So as I said earlier, I think a lot of it goes to what Arun said. Hopefully I said your name correctly. I think it's not just about taking A-level or introductory economics, but I think it's also about the examples, whether or not the examples are the kinds that you see addressing questions that you want to answer. And we don't always see that in economics. It's very sort of, I won't say bland, but it's very focused on issues I think in particular white males may be interested in, and then broader the white community, and not necessarily at the intersection of gender and race and inequality issues.
Yeah. that's definitely something that we picked up on in the network. So a lot of our group chat is around issues that we are more interested in. For example, of course, we're interested in race and stuff like that. But sometimes what you find anyways in UK and university, you'll be studying something about maybe your home country, maybe on the African continent or the Caribbean continent, and you're really interested in it, but you see that all the perspectives are from people from the West, they're not from people on the ground or on the continent. And there's also a conversation to be had about how this plays out on a global scale, because we have a lot of members who are on the African continent, for example, who complain that they're not taken as seriously as economists as those of us who may be in the UK or the US. And so there's actually so many layers to this, but yeah.
There's a couple of questions in the chat that kind of add to that and enlarge that in a way. One is about the issue of diversity in teaching at school and the kind of school level pipeline into this, and whether you know, the points you were making, Felicia, about young people's aspirations appearing achievable, and how we actually you know, get it at that level of the profile of the teaching profession. And then Stefania has also then asked about the diversity in the curriculum that we have on offer, and discriminatory practices in universities, probably generally, but in the construction of the curriculum. And that comes to Carolina and the decolonising part of it. So there's a whole sort of string of things. I don't know whether you want to comment on them, but that whole kind of cascade from the teaching profession into the university curriculum.
So I'll say, I don't know about the UK, but there has been increased conversation about it in the US. So if anybody, Marketplace, NPR's Marketplace, and maybe I'll go see if I can find a link, has been having some conversations. I think Bill Spriggs wrote an open letter to the economics profession just about racism. Gary Hoover was then interviewed on Marketplace about how he brings issues of inequality and discrimination into the intro level, but it has been increased conversation here in the US. Robin Bartlett has a book, I think it's called like Race and Gender and like Intro Economics or something of that sort, but it has been more of the conversation here, that there is an assumption that not only an intro, but if you can offer classes that might talk about women into the economy, poverty, discrimination. Sports economics is one that's also popular here in the US, that it broadens what people begin to get an understanding about what you can do with econ, rather than just like financial markets and topics of that sort.
Please.
Oh, I was just going to say off the back of what Rhonda had just said is, I think it's a little bit more tricky in the UK when it comes to race and speaking about it so openly, because UK culture is quite, we don't want to talk about it too much, you know, we don't want to ruffle the feathers a bit too much. So even you might have known, like, there's been a bit of pushback in even trying to, you know, the national, I forgot the name of the body, but the National Historic Body, who've been trying to like, not expose, but just highlight some of the history of Britain. And people are like, oh no, it's history revisionist. And then when you come to like other things about race, it's like, oh, that's too much. So even to try and change the curriculum to put things that are actual truth, which is actual history, is tricky. So even much more like economics when you're trying to do that. Although I do think the conversation is changing now, especially this year. And I do hope that that does get translated into more interesting things put on the curriculum and what children are taught. But we are facing a lot of pushback, well, from my perspective, in general, on the whole conversation of race in the UK and education, given recent events with Parliament and government and stuff.
Yes, I was going to add briefly to say, I think it's sort of almost even more simple and straight. What you should think of as an even more straightforward level. If you think about the examples that we put in our textbooks, so these are kind of great numbers. We don't have it, unfortunately, for race, but we have the numbers for sex. You know, 92% of the economists in our textbooks that we mentioned are male. 94% of the business leaders that show up in these textbooks are male. 93% of the policymakers we mentioned here are male. 76, three-quarters of the public figures. And actually in the ordinary made up people who are just your example, who are not a real person in any way, 60% of them are male. And it's like, well, if you're making them up, you really have no excuse. I mean, in the other cases, you might want to have some argument that because of history or whatever, you can't help but have to have a biased thing. But, even in the made up cases, it's 60% of them are male. And I think that just sort of is striking, that there's sort of even what seems like a relatively simple thing that we should be able to change very straightforwardly, and that whether you're neoclassical or heterodox or anything else, you should all be able to agree that the made up people could be equal. We can't even seem to get that stuff right. So I think I mean, in some ways I think it highlights mostly a blind spot, because I think once you highlight that to people, no one really ends up thinking, oh no, I can justify why you ought to have had 60% of them being men and 40% being women. And I think that they even sort of think that then about some of the other examples they have. But I think it just sort of highlights that there is just a lack of recognition, and it means that other people have to go and sort of point these things out and kind of take that to them. But actually, so I had a discussion with a brilliant set of LSE students at the moment who were trying to make some changes in what's going on there. And I said, look, a couple of them are basically kind of very well-meaning white men. And I said, look, among your group, you have some people who look very diverse, who would be great role models to go and be some additional public faces out there. You all should be doing stuff. But one of the things that the other guys could do that might not be so exciting, that won't give you all of the kind of great public shape, but is going to be really useful. Why don't you ask your faculty if they'll give you their set of lecture slides, and you can look through for things like this, because these are important things. They're things that go straight through to the undergraduates. It is not going to be the fun, exciting work that will make you the public face of anything, but you don't always have to be the public face of it. And I mean, to their credit, they're doing it. But these are things that are actually really important to do, and you can go and do this, and the faculty will say, oh, well, it's a good idea, but I'm really busy, I have something else to do. All right, take the task off their hands and do it for them. That's a really useful task you could be doing. And it will be really important for them what the undergraduates see. And the faculty are fundamentally not going to change their slides for the next 30 years. So it'll be more equal for the next 30 years after that. That seems like a good move.
There's a couple of questions in the chat which tackle this from a slightly different perspective. One is this notion that is the benchmark the right kind of benchmark? So if you do really well in A-level maths, is that actually the hurdle you need to get over to go and do university level economics, or is that just picking out a set of people from a certain background, say public school background, who are trained to do that particular style of maths in that way? So there's one question about that, and I don't know whether it's linked, but in a way I'm linking it in my mind, because there's another question which says, does the dominance of particular styles in economics, so methodological individualism, for example, stop economics being able to address more sociological and political questions around race and other structured essentialisms? So I'm not sure if those are linked, but in my mind they're tackling slightly similar issues about benchmarking and expectations, and how you select certain people into certain parts of the profession. I don't know whether anyone wants to comment on either of those.
I mean, I pick up on the methodological individualism, I think in the chat that one's aimed at me. There's a couple of things to say about that. So I think so on the sort of plus side, one of the most exciting bits of research I saw, which is like standard, for whatever you think of it, is kind of straightforward neoclassical economics, is a piece that came out last year, I think, or earlier this year, by Chad Jones and a couple of co-authors, looking at the amount of growth in the US that came about from just doing a better job of getting people from underrepresented minorities into top jobs. So they say, look at what the state of employment for people from ethnic minority backgrounds and for women was in the 1960s. Look at what it is now, and try and use that as a way, doing kind of standard standard econometric techniques to try to understand how much of all of growth, which is a thing that all economists are going to say, oh, we care about growth, how can we not be caring about growth? That's a kind of fundamental thing for us. More than half of all growth was caused just by doing a better job of allocating people who were always very good, but who never had any opportunities before, to the forefront, and to be able to be in these kind of places. So what we would think of as productive efficiency, gains in productive allocative efficiency, and that I think is really striking, because it's the kind of topic that economists you can't have any economist who's going to tell you they don't care about growth. That is a thing that we fundamentally think of as in the basic neoclassical world we're going to care about. And using all our standard tools and all our standard techniques, you can realize that this is a really important issue, and therefore we ought to spend time thinking about what the barriers are, because that's really important to us as economists. So I think that's sort of on the plus side. On the negative side, I mean, I also agree with the point that a lot of the modern discussion of issues around around race and ethnicity, as well as on the sex and gender side, are about issues like microaggressions and some of the things that were actually highlighted in the one of the earlier discussions. That I think it's true that the tools that we have as economists are sort of less well aligned with trying to understand some of those concepts. There are some of these things where our approaches that are very individualistic, that are focused on people making, in some sense, rational choices of what exchanges to make under some information sets, thinking about that discrimination is an active choice when people are doing it, whether it's a taste or whether it's statistical. It's all structured very much in that kind of individualistic way. We're less well structured for thinking about what it means to be institutionally biased. We're less well structured to think about how something like microaggression should fit in, to think about the formation of identity. And these are all issues that do show up in sort of the margins of economics, in a sense. I mean, it's not that it's not important, it's also not that there aren't economists studying these things and using those kind of tools, but they're certainly not in what one might call the sort of mainstream of economics. They're not publishing, I mean, in some cases they are now, but they're not mostly publishing in, again, what people loosely think of as the top journals, and therefore that does affect both people's incentive to spend time working on it, and does affect the visibility of that kind of research and the extent to which we sort of are aware of it. I think that's important to recognize, and also for us to try and see. I mean, I think one of the things, just one final thought, is one of the things I find most striking over the last sort of 8 months. Coronavirus came along, which has been a huge shock to everyone in all kinds of ways, and all manner of economists have suddenly learned a whole bunch of epidemiological tools and how to kind of estimate these models that none of us had ever heard of, frankly, a year ago. And the NVER, which is top place in the US for publishing, for showing working papers of famous people effectively, is full. At least half of the papers every week for the last 8 months have been somehow about coronavirus. No one knew how to do any of that kind of work before, but we decided it was important and we started doing it. I feel like if we are going to say that this is also an important issue, we should go and read some of those other things and figure out what, we can't, not all of it's going to be stuff that we can carry over, not all the stuff that we can do, but we should go and engage with it and figure out what there is there that we can use. Because again, we can't use all of the epidemiological stuff, but we figured out what we can use and where we can contribute. And we should be doing the same thing.
Thanks, Aaron. Judith Cabrera-Giulizi has put something interesting comment in the chat about how to motivate students to carry through economics to higher levels of economics degrees through a mix of I guess mentoring and research informed teaching. I think it's a great comment to take forward. But I wondered if we could also just touch on, as we come to the end of the session, an issue that Rhonda brought up earlier this afternoon, which was about accountability. And you were making the point we should have some way of measuring, or some way of defining diversity, perhaps a better way of putting it, some way of defining diversity, and then we should hold institutions and disciplines and entities accountable. And I just wondered if it would be a good way to move towards the end of the session by thinking about that how do we hold organisations accountable? What would accountability look like, and how should we take that forward? Don't know whether any panelists would like to come in on that. Felicia.
I think in terms of accountability, that's what we're currently trying to work on with the Government Economic Service in terms of diversity and stuff. And I think having, first of all, them making a commitment is nice. You get it on paper, they sign it, everyone agrees. Then the next step is actually having, well, for us, having measurements like tracking. So that it's still being worked on now, and they're currently, I think, we're going to be having a review of like diversity in the Government Economic Service, etc. But being able to track the progress, okay, so who's entering the field? Are they progressing? Because there's one thing about like entering, but then when it comes to progression into the higher like senior economic advisors, we're not represented at all, despite the low numbers that are coming in. So it's even worse at the higher levels. And also like what the initiatives are, so that when we have our next catch up with them, we can see like, okay, so what has worked and what hasn't. And then also talking about what has worked and what hasn't, because I feel as though for some organizations, they might decide, yep, we're going to do something. They do something and they're like, oh yeah, we did this, but they don't go back and see, oh, what has this actually done? What has been the impact of this? They don't analyze it, but it looks good. So they continue to do it. So I think in terms of accountability, from my experience, we only started last year, so we're still learning. It's about tracking and measuring so that, you know, there's evidence there. You said it, but did it make the impact that we wanted it to make? And if it didn't, how can we revise this and work together to make sure that we are addressing the issue properly? But yeah.
Thanks. Any other thoughts on that, Rhonda?
So Greg Price and I have probably been talking about this for, and I would say more in public spaces. And what I mean by that is written, not just Greg Price and I having conversations. And we really think that the way that you hold institutions accountable is through funding, that your national organizations that provide funding for us, that's going to be primarily the National Science Foundation, is not going to fund, should not fund institutions that have historically not been diverse. And I think where we, as Felicia mentioned earlier, one of the ways that the US is different is we had the 1965 Civil Rights Act that says that you should not have discriminatory practices. Now, granted, we don't know that if there are no Black faculty, and I'm going to say with Black because it is unlikely in the US that you're going to find an economics department that does not have a woman, who probably does not have an Asian faculty, and I would even say in the broader perspective, a Latino faculty, not just Hispanic, but broader in terms of being a Latino faculty, but you'll find plenty that do not have Black faculty. So there's a chance that people may not want to be in a particular space, and that's possible. But it is hard to imagine that in states where there is a large Black population, that you couldn't find someone to hire to be on your faculty. So we argue that one of the ways that you hold folks accountable is through the purse string, right? We know that's one way to get people to make change is to deny finances. And so that's what we have argued. Penalties for not are through the dough.
Do you think that will that will get any traction? Because I was just reading an editorial earlier this afternoon about the British government backing off from getting funding organisations to either incentivise or withhold funds on the basis of like these Athena Swan and race equality charters.
I would argue probably not, and for a lot of the reasons that Arun had said earlier, a lot of these institutions are going to be places that are producing research. Right. And so it's sort of a chicken egg. If you're not funding their research, then how are you moving a variety of spaces forward? But I think that if you're not willing to withhold funding, then it comes back to the question, and Felicia's talked about commitments, but commitments mean nothing if you don't have teeth behind them. I mean, the one thing that you learn in game theory is about being a credible threat, right? If we're playing this repeated game with you coming in for funding, and I'm not a credible threat, you have no incentive to change your behavior. Withholding funding will get folks to do things differently. Now, having said that, I have also said in public spaces, I do not want you to hire anyone that you are not going to treat appropriately, right? If you're not going to treat well as a faculty member, don't hire them. Because I do think for many of us, the damage, and I do mean that, the damage, the harm, I think Kristen talked about the harm from divorce, the harm that occurs when you have been an academic and treated poorly, when you are, in particular, not a white male and you don't get tenure, what that means long-term for your professional career is very different. I gave up tenure. I experienced that the profession was not ready for someone who looked like me, I think both in terms of gender, race, and my professional experience, to then be rehired, right? So I think the consequences are different. So if you don't have a commitment to getting someone through the tenure process, please, again, don't hire them. But I do think that you have to penalize them with money.
Yeah. Anybody else want to come in on that question of accountability? Okay, there are a few more things in the chat. There's Stefania brings up the question of a lot of the work, and I'm thinking maybe too much of the work on diversity is done on a volunteering basis, by people from underrepresented groups. So some sort of recognition and funding might be the...
I would agree
Yeah.
with that.
So-
I
so
think
Steph-
a lot of the work that we do is for free. And when the protest for Black Lives Matter came up, everybody was like, oh, is there someone from your organization who can read our statements? Are there people that can do this and this? And it was all on a free basis. I was like, we all have full-time jobs, you know, like this is not something that we do, you know, to get paid for. We do it because we care. But then in terms of the support and the level of funding, it wasn't matching. So then after that, that's when I decided that we would start raising money, because I guess it was taking its toll on a lot of us. It's like, it's almost as if we as ethnic minorities face the problem, and then the problem of fixing it is put back on us, when it should be the other way around. So I do agree that, yeah, the volunteer basis in which a lot of the work has to be done, which is currently being done, it needs to be reworked and rethought about. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I was going to say, Steffi is talking from experience, because Felicia runs TBEN. With Sarah Smith, I run Discover, also on, you know, in our spare time. We're both academics as our actual jobs. We don't get any, I mean, I don't need funding for myself, but funding for my organization, and similarly funding for TBEN. And Steffi is the new diversity champion for the Royal Economic Society, also on a voluntary basis. So with some experience, we all know that we do this stuff because we think it's important, but we don't get any way. It would be useful to have ways in which this were recognized and were sort of gave us credit in some other way to allow it to be kind of possible. Not even, and I think the answer is not even necessarily for the individuals who are doing it, but you know, as a practical matter, if you want to keep these organizations going, if you want to be able to bring more people in to be able to do things, you know, it might be that Felicia's fantastic, and we've spoken many times about the stuff that she's doing at TBEN. It's great. If she wants to be able to bring in more people to also help contribute stuff, some of them will say, well, look, we have all these other constraints. Can you help us solve some of those so that we can afford to do this? And if the answer from her is no, we can't, and similarly for us at Discover, because we don't have any funding and support, and so we're just having to get everyone who has the ability to contribute in their spare time and has that spare time available to them, doesn't have other big caring responsibilities, or doesn't have some other constraint, whether it's just trying to keep a job down or 2 jobs down, whatever it is, to keep themselves going, trying to find to move between jobs because they didn't make tenure, trying to, you know, whatever else that there are the constraints in their lives. If you don't have access to support for those things, then it is really difficult. I mean, we know that, and so it is really important to try and find ways in which we can, where again, I mean, research councils could say, well, you know, what at one end you could say, okay, what we need to do is to say we're not going to fund some of these organizations, as Rhonda says. The other one, they could say it's really important these things happen. We realize these organizations aren't doing it directly. We're going to go to organizations like TBEN or Discover or whoever else and talk to them about whether we can fund them because they're doing useful stuff that's useful for the, you know, they talk about in the REF, which is this kind of way in which we're all measured in UK academia, environment as one of the important areas, isn't it? It's sort of this, what's your research like, what's your impact like, and what's the environment like? And I mean, for the research environment in the UK, it is these sorts of organizations that are trying to do things to make it more palatable for a wider range of people. If we've agreed it's a thing that universities are going to find hard individually to do because it's a collective action problem, then you need to fund the organizations that are trying to solve those collective action problems and are trying to find solutions. You need to just fund them directly somehow. Sorry, Carolina's trying to jump in as well.
No, sorry.
Oh, and sorry, I forgot.
Decon
as well. Sorry, Decon as well. I completely.
That I would add, but it's because Susan just said we're gonna say about the last word, and because I want to talk about Decon that you haven't mentioned, so I said no, not yet.
Yeah, sorry, Decon.
Because I just want to add that the funding. I mean, Felicia and Arun has said. But I want to add that Decon, and also because Decon has this radical and heterodox perspective, we've been on the road for longer than many of the institutions that Arun has mentioned, but we haven't been supported by them. Of course, as I said, I think the effect that what happens in the US in March has opened doors for Decon from institutions that a year ago had closed door for us very clearly. Even if you send in an email saying that we exist. Because of because we have chosen words decolonization, because we have heterodox in our mission statement, we have these doors very closed. So what I want to highlight is like funding is key, and you have to open the doors, but to have what has been mentioned before, as Rhonda said, you know, deprive these we use funds to use the fund as a way to bargain to then get things done. But also, if that doesn't come with the discussion we had before about being open about ideological perspectives or different approaches, we're still going to close door for others doing voluntary work. For example, Decon actually different than Stefania, who has a permanent position, Felicia and Arun. We are actually, most of us, we don't, still are young scholars without a permanent position. In every meeting we have is not just about funding, it's about how vocal we can be, because not going to get hired in a year's time if we get to be too vocal. So I think there is that should be highlighted as well.
I should say I also don't have a permanent position yet. I'm still on the.
Sorry, I didn't know.
I would like one, unless you know something I don't.
And so I would say on the backside of that, and I know that that I speak from a position of privilege, not just in terms of having a supportive family, but having stuff that allowed me to start Wiser. That I would encourage folks that, and I'm not diminishing having a permanent position, but I do think that there comes a point in our lives where we have to make a decision how much we're going to keep pushing from inside and trying to ask people to value what it is, what we do, versus taking a step out and starting starting something of your own that you don't have to convince people that there's value. And then I think the other part of that is we have to be more strategic in our partnership, right? That there's Wiser is partnering with Howard University, who has the American Economics Summers Program, and we're going to provide inclusive peer on-site and distance mentoring. That's going to be, that allows me to sort of stay in the space about mentoring undergrads for a program that I've had a relationship with, but it also allows me to get to funders to get to know Wiser, because when we're applying for funding, we go in as a group to have some conversations. So I think that, as you're thinking about the work that you're doing, the question is, who are the organizations that you can partner with that are known, that benefit from your relationship, that will then allow funders to see you and the work that you do, and the benefits of that, as opposed to being more of a threat.
Well, there's so much to so much of this conversation to continue, isn't there? And we have hit that 5 o'clock mark, and I know that Angus is going to want to say a few words, but if I could say to Kristen, who's had to leave the call, Interman, to Rhonda, Vonshay, Sharpe, Carolina Alves, Arun Advani, and Felicia Odammten, I think this has been a really challenging and great part of a conversation that's going to have to go along for much longer still. So thank you for coming and sharing. Thank you for inviting me to be the chair. And if I could hand back to Angus now, who's really been behind setting this whole series up, I'll do that. But thanks everyone for a great discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. And can I also thank the speakers, Felicia, Arun, and before the break, Rhonda, Kristen, and Carolina Alves, for all of your fantastic contributions. Susan, I knew you'd be a great chair, and you've definitely lived up to my hopes. You've been absolutely fantastic in this, maintaining a really vibrant and really intellectually interesting, but also fun discussion, which has been really great from many different perspectives. And in Rebuilding Macroeconomics, this is our third Women in Macro event, conference in our 3 years of existence. One of the reasons why we're so keen to do this is because macroeconomics is not an amorphous body that just exists. It's made up by the people who do it. So who do macroeconomics really matters. They decide what macroeconomics is. And the very privileged place that we have in public debates in the UK, as we've heard today, means it really should be at least representative of the population of our society overall. So that's exactly why we're so keen to promote this, and from different perspectives, which we've heard today. And it's been an extraordinarily interesting and vibrant afternoon. So thank you very much indeed, Susan, and to all the speakers. And there's one final thanks. You said that I've been working in the background to do this. Actually, there's somebody else who's been doing it. That's Carla Koberger, who's our research assistant at Rebuilding Macroeconomics. She's the one that's put it all together so terrifically. So I would like to extend my sincere and warm congratulations and thanks to her for all of her work. And thank you to all of the people who've been attending this afternoon, and do keep in touch. You know our website is rebuildingmacroeconomics.ac.uk, and I hope you can come to other of our events. We have another one on the 24th with Reading University about macroeconomics and reality on the 24th. So please do join us for that. And thank you again to all the speakers and to you, Susan. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.